The leather strap slipped through the brass buckle again. I yanked it back, the sudden jerk sending a shock of pain up my neck. There was no use in gear that sat perfectly on the parade square at Aldershot if it sliced the flesh from your shoulder by the second mile, and I knew better than to trust the fit until the load had truly settled. Sweat had turned the hide slick, rendering the friction useless against the 20-pound drag off the 1908 pattern webbing. A blister was blooming on my left shoulder, right where the cross strap bit into the collarbone, a small hot spot that would surely rot into a raw ulcer before we sighted the next village. I rubbed the place with my thumb, feeling the wool tunic grind against the tightening skin beneath. "Keep still, Richards." The sergeant major's voice did not come from behind me this time, but lived inside my own skull, a habit drilled in during the long, static years in India where a shift in the ranks meant a rifle butt toth ribs. I stood by the roadside south of Mons, boots caked in the grey dust that rose in choking clouds from the convoy wheels. The heat pressed downward, a physical weight. It was not the damp, penetrating cold of Wales or the chill of the drill yard. This was a dry bay-coven heaviness that smelled of horse dung, raw petrol, and the sour tang of unwashed men. "Straps loose again, Frank." Private Miller stood to my left, passing his rifle from one sweating palm to the other. He looked green about the gills, his tunic darkened by great salt-stained patches under the arms. "It's settled," I said. "Leather stretches." "Mine's cutting into my neck, thinking of padding it with a handkerchief." "Don't, it chafes worse once the cloth gets wet." Miller nodded, accepting the verdict without argument. He was a new boy, scarcely 6 months with the battalion, still expecting this war to resemble the bright recruiting posters pinned to the wall in Blaina. He did not yet understand that comfort was a luxury paid for later, usually in blood or blisters. I turned my mind back to the pack. The canvas remained stiff, rubbed with dubbin until it gleamed a dark, oily brown, yet the contents shifted whenever I drew breath. Inside lay an extra pair of socks, grey wool, untouched. I had considered leaving them on the discard pile back at the staging area, for regulation demanded we travel light and claimed survival depended on speed. Yet I kept them. Aunt Sarah had knit them in December, and to throw them away felt like discarding a piece of the house on the hill, that place where the coal dust never quite scrubbed from the window sills. I tightened the buckle one notch. The brass gave a sharp, satisfying click. The road stretched ahead, a white ribbon of stone vanishing into the shimmering haze. Tall poplars lined the sides, offering no shade at this hour, while beyond them the fields lay flat and exposed, terrifyingly open. We had stood here for an hour. The order to move had come at dawn, only to change to stand to, and then to wait once more. Uncertainty sat heavier on the spirit than the entrenching tool handle digging hard into the small of my back. Further up the column, a motor lorry stalled, belching a plume of black smoke that hung motionless in the still air. No man cheered. No man complained. We simply waited for the fumes to clear. I shifted the rifle sling. The walnut wood of the SMLE felt warm from the sun, smelling of oil and the faint, acrid residue of cordite from the practice Ranger's A scent that usually settled the nerves, but today only dried my mouth. I checked the water bottle at my hip. It was full, but I would not touch it until the sergeant gave the leave. My throat parched, I swallowed hard, the dust coating the back of my palate, gritty and insistent. "Look at him," Miller whispered. "Davies is checking his watch again." I glanced down the line. Corporal Davies stood rigid, a silver pocket watch open in his palm. He was not so much reading the time as measuring the widening gap between orders. He caught my gaze and offered a small, tight shake of the head. No movement yet. Davies snapped the watch shut, slipped it into his tunic pocket, and patted the fabric as if to reassure himself of its safety. Davies carried a book in his rucksack as well, a volume of poetry. He had once told me that words kept the mind from rotting when the body grew tired. I never told him that words would not stop a bullet, though there was no need. He knew it already. A fly landed on my cheek. I flicked it away with a twitch of muscle. Heat shimmered off the tarmac, making the distant trees dance like mirages. My shoulder throbbed where Thess registered ear-cute copyright bit deep. I adjusted the tunic pad, pulling the wool clear of the skin before letting it snap back against the flesh. Pain was information. It told me the pack remained, and that I was still the one carrying it. Some men nearby had loosened their belts, allowing their tunics to hang open in defiance of discipline. I kept mine buttoned to the chin. Sloppiness invited trouble, and trouble always invited the sergeant major. My mind drifted to the retreat in Afghanistan, those long marches where the sun claimed more men than the tribesmen ever did. This felt much the same. The enemy was not yet visible, merely a pressure on the nape of the neck, a sensation that the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to break. "Bet we move at dusk," Miller said. "Bet we don't. Why stay here? It's open ground." "Orders. Stupid orders. Keep your voice down." Miller clamped his mouth shut. He stared down the road, eyes scanning the dark line of trees, desperate to see something a German Ulan, a spy, any justification for the sweat running cold down his spine. There was nothing, only the dust, the stalled lorry, and the rhythmic stamping of horses on the hard surface. I shifted me weight from one foot to the other, the new boots, issued in England, biting into my heels with stiff, unforgiving leather. They would blister next. I could feel the friction beginning there too. I reached into my tunic pocket for a pencil. The paper was folded small and tucked against my chest, safe from the worst of the sweat. I wanted to write to Aunt Sarah, to tell her the heat was severe but the men were well, to lie about the endless waiting, and to claim I had posted a letter from Mons before our departure. She worried excessively about the post, believing that if the letters ceased, the connection between us would snap. I could not tell her that the connection was already fraying, stretched thin across the channel like a telegraph wire in a gale. I returned the pencil to my pocket. Not yet. A shout broke the stillness, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the haze like a knife. "Oi, watch the stride, you lot, look alive." Bert Evans had stepped out of the ranks, abandoning the slouch that had become our uniform. He threw his chest forward until the buttons of his tunic strained, lifted his chin so high he looked down his nose at us, and began to march. His legs moved with an exaggerated, mechanical stiffness, knees locking with every step, arms swinging in rigid arcs that mocked the very soul out of discipline. He puffed out his cheeks and blew imaginary dust from an invisible medal on his breast, his eyes wide and comically serious, performing the caricature of a recruiting sergeant we had all seen 100 times in the town squares back home. Left, right, Bert bellowed, his voice cracking with the effort of the imitation before he cried out, "Chin up, lads. The king's shilling buys you a grave with a view." A ripple of laughter went through the section, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to scrape the throat. Miller grinned, the tension in his jaw loosening for a fraction of a second. Even the men 2 ranks ahead turned their heads, shoulders shaking. It was a dangerous game, this mockery of authority under the open sky, but Bert possessed a fool's luck that made him believe himself immune to consequence. He spun on his heel, bringing his rifle up with a flourish that nearly knocked the cap off a passing private, and bowed with theatrical grace. "Evans!" The word did not shout, it sliced. Corporal Davies stood 3 paces away, his face a mask of pale, tight control. He had not raised his voice, yet the sound carried further than Bert's bellowing ever could. The laughter died instantly, strangled in the throats of the men. Bert froze mid-bow, one leg still awkwardly extended, his grin slipping into a grimace of mild surprise. He straightened slowly, the mockery draining out of his posture until he was just a tired man in a dirty tunic again. "Fall in, Private," Davies said, his voice quiet and devoid of anger, which made it worse. "We are not on the parade ground in Brecon. We are on the road to whatever hell waits for us." Bert opened his mouth, likely to offer some quip about the heat or the view, but thought better of it. He shuffled back into line, his boots scuffing the dust. "Just keeping spirits up, Corp," he muttered, barely audible. "Mum's pie crust is harder than this march anyway, you know that." "Save the pie talk for the dugout," Davies replied, already turning away. He reached into his tunic pocket and withdrew the silver watch again. The chain glinted, a brief flash of metal against the grey wool. He snapped the case open, stared at the dial for a long, uncomfortable second, then snapped it shut. The click was small, final. "Check your webbing, we move in 10 minutes. And Evans, if I see you step out of line again, you'll carry my pack as well as your own." "Yes, Corb." Davies walked back to his position, the heels of his boots striking the road with a precise, rhythmic cadence that seemed to measure out the remaining seconds of our stay. He did not look at us. He looked at the horizon, where the poplars stood like silent sentinels against the burning sky. I watched him, noting the way his hand rested on the pocket that held his book. He touched it often, a nervous tick, as if ensuring the words were still there, still safe from the dust and the heat. A volume of poetry. In this place, it seemed the most useless thing in the world, heavier than lead and softer than tissue, yet he kept it, just as I kept the socks. I shifted the rifle on my shoulder. The wood was hot now, burning through the tunic. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The weight had stretched too long. The initial discipline was fraying, replaced by a low-level itch of anxiety that crawled under the skin. Men began to fidget, adjusting straps, scratching necks, shifting weight from foot to foot. The stalled lorry up ahead had cleared, moving off with a grinding of gears that sounded painfully loud in the sudden quiet. The road was open. The air felt thinner, charged with something unspoken. I pulled the pencil from my pocket again. The paper was warm against my fingers. There was no time for a proper letter, no shelter to lean against, but the need to mark the moment, to assert that I was here and thinking of Blaina, overrode the caution that had held me back before. I pressed the graphite to the page, the tip scratching softly. Dearest Aunt Sarah, I write this by the roadside south of Mons. The heat is tremendous, such as I have not felt since India. The men are in good spirits, though tired. Bert Evans sends his regards and says to tell you his mother's pie is the only thing that could improve the rations. We are well supplied, and the weather holds. I stopped, the pencil hovered over the paper. Behind us, far to the north, a sound rolled across the fields. It was not thunder. The sky was clear, a hard, unbroken blue. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping, like a giant heart beating slowly beneath the earth. The ground did not shake, not yet, but the air seemed to vibrate with it, a low frequency that settled in the teeth. Miller heard it too. He turned, eyes wide, sweeping his gaze across the tree line. What's that? Artillery, I said, keeping my voice level, distant. Ours. Likely theirs. I looked at the paper. The weather holds. A lie. The weather was fine, but the world was ending. I could not tell her about the sound. I could not describe the way the birds had stopped singing an hour ago, or the way the dust seemed to settle differently, as if the air itself was holding still. I continued writing, the letters becoming slightly more jagged. Do not worry about the post. I shall dispatch this at the next village. The retreat is merely strategic, so the officers say. We shall be back in Mons before the week is out. Keep the garden tidy for me. I signed my name, Frank. The ink looked black and stark against the cheap, creamy paper. I folded the sheet quickly, the creases sharp and precise. There was no envelope. We had been issued none. I would have to find one or hope the postmaster in the next town had a spare. I tucked the letter into my tunic pocket next to the pencil, feeling the thin rectangle against my ribs. It felt fragile, insignificant, a piece of paper against the gathering storm. Stand to. The command rippled down the line, passed from mouth to mouth, a whisper that grew into a shout. No bugle called us, no drum beat, just the voices of men, urgent and low. The platoon snapped into motion, a sudden jerking awake of 60 tired bodies. Rifles were shouldered, straps tightened, packs hitched up. The easy waiting was over. The air had changed. The pressure on the nape of my neck was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. About turn. We pivoted. The movement was clumsy, boots scraping, equipment clattering. I turned my back on the north, on the sound of the guns, on the road we had marched down with such confidence 2 days prior. Now we faced south. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out before us like grasping fingers. The pack settled onto my shoulders, the weight sudden and absolute, as if the earth had reached up and grabbed hold of me. Move out, keep the distance, close up. The column lurched forward. Dust rose in clouds, choking and thick. I took the first step, then the second. The rhythm of the march took over, a mechanical tramping that required no thought. Left, right, left, right. The sound of the guns grew slightly louder, or perhaps it was just the silence in my own head that made them seem so. I walked, watching the back of the man in front, counting the paces, trying not to think about the letter in my pocket. The light began to fail. The harsh white of the afternoon softened into a bruised purple. the shadows lengthening until they merged into a single grey mass. The road became a tunnel of twilight. Men stumbled, cursed under their breath, corrected their course. The heat lingered, trapped in the wool of the tunics, but a chill was creeping in from the fields, a dampness that promised a cold night. I reached up to touch the pocket where the letter lay. The paper felt thin, vulnerable. I had not sealed it. There was no wax, no spit to close the fold. The edges were open, exposed to the sweat of my body, the dust of the road, the night air that was already thick with the smell of unwashed men and fear. Words spilled out into the dark, unguarded. We are well supplied. The weather holds. Lies, all of them, drifting loose in the gloom, ready to be torn away by the wind or rubbed into nothing by the friction of the march. I kept walking. The column wound ahead, a snake of grey figures disappearing into the gloom. I could not stop to fix it. To pause was to break the line, to invite the wrath of the NCOs, to lose the rhythm that kept us moving. So I walked, the unsealed letter beating against my heart with every step, a small, open wound in the dark. The leather bit deep, a fresh blister, hot and wet, rubbed raw against the collarbone where the water bottle swung. I hitched the pack higher, the canvas groaning under the weight of iron rations and a shovel that felt like an anchor. 10 miles, maybe 12. The road stretched out, a grey ribbon unspooling into the dusk, crowded with the shuffling backs of men who had forgotten how to stand straight. "Keep your interval, Richards." Davies moved alongside me, his step precise, almost dainty, despite the load. He adjusted his spectacles, pushing them up the bridge of a nose slick with grime. The lenses caught the last bruised light of the sun, flashing white for a second before he turned his head away from the wind. "Trying, Corp," I said. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the tramping of 60 pairs of hobnailed boots. Straps gone soft, slips every time I breathe. "Then tighten it before the skin breaks." He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the heels of the man in front, a rhythm he maintained with religious devotion. "Panic is a luxury, blisters are a fact, deal with the fact." I stopped walking for a half-second, just long enough to yank the leather tab of the shoulder strap, pulling it tight until the buckle dug into my tunic. The pain sharpened, then settled into a dull, throbbing ache, better that than the raw scrape of loose canvas. I fell back into step, the rhythm broken and then repaired. Ahead, the column bunched up. A lorry had stalled near the crossroads, its engine dead, steam hissing from the radiator into the cooling air. Men flowed around it like water around a stone, muttering curses, shoulders brushing, the smell of petrol mixing with the scent of unwashed wool and horse dung. "Bloody motor," someone spat, "should be walking anyway." Then a laugh cut through the grumble, loud, too loud for a retreat. "Look at 'em, stiff as poker." Bert Evans was ahead, near the stalled lorry. He had broken rank just enough to strut, knees high, chest puffed out, mimicking the rigid, goose-stepping walk of a Prussian guardsman he'd once seen in an illustrated paper. He swung his arms like mechanical pistons, his face twisted into a caricature of arrogant severity. "Halt in the name of the Kaiser," Bert bellowed, his voice cracking with forced joviality. He spun on his heel, nearly colliding with a mule train squeezing past the lorry. "You there, Private Evans? Why is your rifle not polished? Do you wish to spend the night in the guardhouse?" A ripple of laughter went through the nearby section, tense and brittle, but real. Men smiled, if only for a second, their eyes crinkling at the corners. It was a defiance, a small spit in the eye of the fear that had been creeping up our spines since the guns started talking. "Bert!" The shout didn't come from an officer. It came from Davies, who had stopped dead in the road, ignoring the press of bodies behind him. He wasn't shouting in anger, but with a sharp, cutting clarity that sliced through the noise. Bert froze mid-strut, one leg still raised absurdly high. He lowered it slowly, the grin slipping from his face like a mask falling away. "Gob!" "Get back in line," Davies said. His voice was low, but it carried. He pulled a silver pocket watch from his vest, flipped the lid, and glanced at the face. The chain glinted dull gold against the grey wool of his tunic. "We are behind schedule. The order is to clear this sector before full dark. Your theatrics do not help the pace." "Just having a bit of fun, Corp," Bert muttered as he shuffled back into the ranks, brushing past me with a heavy scent of stale tobacco and sweat clinging to his clothes before he added, "God knows we need it." "Save it for the dugout," Davies said, snapping the watch shut before tucking it away with economical, precise movements. "March." The column surged forward again, the gap closed. The lorry was behind us, a silent monument to mechanical failure. The darkness was pressing in now, the edges of the field dissolving into a thick, impenetrable black. The trees on either side of the road were no longer individual shapes, but a solid wall of shadow, leaning in as if to listen. I reached into my tunic again. The letter was still there. I could feel the edge of the paper against my ribs, a tiny, rectangular intrusion. My thumb found the fold. It was open, just a simple crease, no wax, no gum, nothing to hold the two halves together. "Dearest Aunt Sarah." The words were exposed. If I stumbled, if I fell into the mud, if a stray branch caught the pocket, the paper could slide out. Lost, gone into the ditch where the rats lived, or worse, found by someone who wouldn't care about the garden in Blaina or the strategic nature of the retreat. I tried to pinch the fold shut with my fingers while walking, a clumsy dance of hand and shoulder. The pack swung, throwing me off balance. I stumbled, my boot catching on a rut. "Careful," Miller whispered from behind, his hand gripping my elbow for a second to steady me. "Don't go down, not here." "I'm fine," I said, shaking him off. I pressed my hand flat against my chest, holding the letter in place. Just a stone. It wasn't a stone, but my own stupidity. In the rush to move, driven by the need to pretend that writing a letter was normal while the world collapsed behind us, I had forgotten the most basic step: seal it. Spit on the flap, press it down, do anything. Now it was just loose paper in a pocket full of sweat. The road dipped. We were leaving the high ground, moving into a hollow where the air felt heavier, colder. The mist was rising from the fields, a white ghost limb that clung to our ankles. The sound of the guns had changed too. No longer a distant rumble, it was a distinct, rhythmic crashing, closer now, thump, 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 like a hammer driving nails into a coffin lid. "Keep moving," Davies called out, his voice strained. "Do not stop for anything." A shell screamed overhead, high, too high. It passed over us with a tearing sound, like canvas ripping, and landed somewhere in the field to our left. A flash of orange light bloomed in the mist, brief and sickly, followed by the dull crunch of earth falling back to earth. No one flinched. We just walked faster. I kept my hand on my pocket, where the paper felt damp now, whether from sweat or maybe the mist. It didn't matter. The words were bleeding out into the lining of my tunic, invisible ink soaking into the wool. "We are well supplied." The lie was seeping into my skin. Bert was ahead again, his silhouette distinct against the grayer dark of the road. He wasn't joking now. He walked with his head down, shoulders hunched against the weight of the pack, the same as the rest of us. The laughter was gone, eaten by the night. "Frank." I looked up. Davies had dropped back again. He was walking close, so close I could see the flecks of dust on his glasses. "Yes, Corp." "That letter," he said, never looking at me as he kept his gaze fixed on the road and the feet of the men ahead. "You wrote to your aunt." "Yes." "Good." He paused, the steady, unbroken rhythm of his boots on the hard dirt filling the silence. "Make sure she gets it. People need to know we're still here, even if." He trailed off. A shell landed closer this time, to the right. The flash lit up the ditch, revealing the twisted roots of an upturned tree, the mud churning. The blast hit us a second later, a wave of pressure that pushed against our backs, shoving us forward. Dust choked the air, gritty and sour. "Head down," someone yelled. We kept walking, and though no one dropped or sought cover, there was none to be found, leaving only the road, the dark, and the weight on our shoulders. Davies straightened his tunic, a reflex action, smoothing the crease that wasn't there anymore. "Even if the news isn't what she hopes for," he finished, his voice barely audible over the tramping. "Truth is better than silence, Frank. Remember that." "I will," I said. But I couldn't tell him about the open flap. I couldn't say that the truth was currently flapping loose in my pocket, vulnerable to the first bit of rain or the first careless reach of my own hand. I just nodded, a jerk of the chin in the gloom. The column wound on, a snake of grey ghosts sliding into the mouth of the night. The mist thickened, wrapping around our legs, cold and wet. The road ahead disappeared into the white void. We were walking blind, step by step, trusting that the ground would still be there when our boots came down. I pressed my hand harder against my chest. The paper crinkled, a dry, brittle sound that seemed deafening in the quiet moments between shells. It was open, the words were loose, and we were walking deeper into the dark, where nothing stayed safe and nothing stayed sealed. The darkness swallowed the man in front of me. I stepped into the space he had left, the mud sucking at my boots, the unsealed letter beating against my ribs like a second, failing heart. The straps had chewed through the skin hours ago, back near the crossroads where the mule train blocked the way, and we stood sweating in our greatcoats while the officers shouted themselves hoarse. Now the canvas rubbed raw flesh against raw flesh, a wet, grinding friction that sent a sharp, hot spike of pain up my neck with every left footfall. I kept my chin tucked, eyes fixed on the muddy heel of the man ahead, refusing to let the grimace twist my mouth. To stop was to invite the provosts, or worse, the pity of the new boys who still walked with a bounce in their step, unaware that the road would eat that bounce before we reached the next village. My shoulder burned. A blister, large as a shilling and thick with yellow fluid, had burst inside my tunic an hour back, leaking serum that soaked the wool and made the straps stick, peel, and tear again. Step, drag, step. The rhythm was a hammer. It drove into the bone. I shifted the pack, trying to find an angle where the weight sat on the hip bone rather than the ruined shoulder, but the load refused to settle. It was too heavy for a retreat and too full for a man who should have dropped his spare socks 2 towns back. Regulations said to lighten the load when the column moved fast. Everyone knew it. The sergeants turned a blind eye so long as you could keep the pace, but I had kept everything. The extra ammunition, the tin of bully beef Aunt Sarah sent in August, the shaving mirror that was cracked down the middle. They sat in the canvas like stones, pulling me backward while my legs fought to push forward. Hold! The order rippled down the line, a ragged shout that died quickly in the damp air. We didn't collapse. There was no energy for collapsing. We simply stopped where we stood, leaning into the momentum of the halt, swaying slightly like corn in a wind that wasn't blowing. We were in the yard of a Belgian farmhouse, or what was left of one. The roof had gone, torn away by a shell that must have landed days prior, leaving the rafters exposed to the grey sky like broken ribs. Chickens scratched at the mud near the pump, ignoring us entirely. They were the only things in France that didn't care about the Kaiser or the king. Bert dropped his pack with a grunt that sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. He slumped against the trough, pulling a haversack from his belt with fingers that trembled just enough to be noticeable if you were looking for weakness. I wasn't looking. I was too busy trying to peel the wet strap from my shoulder without screaming. Rations, Bert said. His voice was rough, stripped of the boom it had carried in the barracks at Aldershot. He fumbled in the bag and produced a biscuit, hard as a brick and color of dust. He tossed it to me. I caught it one-handed, the impact stinging my palm. King's iron, good for the teeth, they say, keeps the bayonet sharp in the gut. I looked at the biscuit, where a piece of chipped flint sat embedded in the surface. Save it for the Germans, Bert. I'm not hungry. Eat it, Frank. He broke his own in half, the sound crisp and loud in the quiet yard. Dust puffed up from the break. You look like a ghost already. No use haunting Blainer before you're dead. I'm saving it. For what? The rapture? Bert shoved half the biscuit into his mouth, chewing with an exaggerated crunch that made my own teeth ache in sympathy. He grinned, crumbs falling onto his tunic. Sarah send anything else, or just more sermons about the Temperance League? Zogs. Our wool the cure for all ills. He swallowed, wiping his mouth with the back of a hand blackened by grease and dirt. Give us a pair, for my toes are blue, proper blue, like a smurf in a storybook. Not yet. I reached into my own pack, fingers brushing the rough canvas of the parcel Sarah had forced on me at the station. The string was still tied tight, but I had cut it open 2 nights ago to check the contents. 2 pairs of thick grey wool socks, a tin of beef tea, a small cake wrapped in wax paper that smelled faintly of home, of flour and sugar, and a kitchen that didn't have mud in the corners. I had eaten the cake immediately, standing in the dark while the others slept, feeling the sugar hit my blood like a shot of rum. The socks I had left. They sat at the bottom of the pack, clean and dry, a reserve for a cold that hadn't arrived yet but felt inevitable, looming like a storm front. "Not yet, Bert," I repeated, pulling my hand out empty. "It's not cold enough." "It's freezing, you idiot." "It's autumn, wait for the frost." Bert shrugged, the movement making his pack straps creak. He knew better than to argue when I got that tone. It was the same tone I used when refusing a drink from a canteen that smelled of stagnant pond water. He turned his attention elsewhere, scanning the yard until his eyes landed on Davies. Corporal Davies sat apart from us, perched on the edge of the dry stone trough. He wasn't eating. He wasn't resting in the way the rest of us were, slumped and leaking exhaustion. He sat upright, knees together, hands busy with a small white cloth. His spectacles were off, held delicately between his thumb and forefinger. He was polishing the lenses, rubbing in small circular motions, ignoring the grime on his own face, which was streaked with soot from the cooking fires we hadn't lit. "Look at him," Bert muttered, nudging me with an elbow, "polishing his eyes while the world goes to hell. Reckon he thinks if he sees clear enough, he'll spot a way out of this mess." "He likes them clean," I said. "He's mad, that's what he is, mad as a hatter." Bert took another bite of the biscuit, wincing as he ground his teeth against the hardness. "Hey, Corp, save some sight for the rest of us, eh? We might need to borrow a pair of eyes if the Bosch get too close." Davies didn't look up. He finished the circle, held the glasses up to the light to inspect the smear, and then breathed on the glass to fog it before polishing again. "Clean lenses prevent strain, Evans," he said, his voice calm, detached. "And if we are to march tonight, I intend to see where I am putting my feet, unlike some who seem content to follow the man in front into a ditch." "Ditch is better than the road," Bert shot back, but there was no heat in it. He finished the biscuit and brushed the crumbs from his tunic, patting his pockets as if checking for something he had lost. He patted the left breast pocket, then the right. His fingers lingered on the right side, hovering over the fabric, then moved away. He stood up, kicking his pack with the toe of his boot to settle the weight. "Right, that's the iron ration done. Who's for a smoke?" "No smoking," Davies said, finally putting his glasses on. He blinked, adjusting to the world, then picked up a small leather-bound book from beside him. It was worn, the corners soft, the spine cracked. He opened it to a marked page, his finger tracing the line. "Orders say no fires, no lights, no smoke. We move in 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Bert repeated, the words flat. He looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before the mask of the Joker slid back into place. "Better make it count, Frank. 10 minutes to live like a king." He reached out, clapping a hand on my shoulder. The pressure sent a jolt of fire through the raw skin beneath my tunic, but I didn't flinch. I just nodded, watching him turn away to check his rifle bolt, his movements sharp and efficient despite the fatigue. He didn't look at his pockets again. He didn't check for the tin. The whistle blew, a shrill, piercing note that cut through the murmur of the yard. "Fall in," the sergeant major bellowed, his voice cracking with the effort. "Move, move, move." The stillness shattered. Men scrambled, hoisting packs, grabbing rifles, the sudden noise of buckles clinking and boots scuffing the stones rising up to meet the grey sky. I heaved my pack up, the strap biting into the wound on my shoulder, the pain so sharp it brought water to my eyes. I blinked it away, stepping into the line, falling into the rhythm of the march before my body had fully accepted the weight. We filed out of the yard, past the chickens, past the broken roof, back onto the road that stretched north into the mist. The air grew colder as we left the shelter of the buildings. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet earth and something metallic, like old pennies. "Keep the distance," Davies called from somewhere ahead, his voice steady despite the jostling. "Do not bunch up." I walked, my shoulders screamed. The pack felt heavier now, laden with the biscuit I hadn't eaten and the socks I wouldn't wear. I kept my hand near my chest, a habit born of the unsealed letter, but my fingers brushed against something hard and cold in my tunic pocket. Not paper, metal. I frowned, slowing my pace slightly until the man behind bumped into me. "Keep moving," he hissed. I ignored him, slipping my hand into the pocket. My fingers closed around a small, round object. I pulled it out, just enough to see in the failing light. It was a tin, brown dented, the lid slightly askew, Player's Weights, Bert's Tobacco. I stopped dead, the man behind me cursed and shoved past, stumbling into the mud of the ditch. I didn't watch him go. I stared at the tin in my hand, the metal cold against my palm. Bert had patted his pocket. He had checked for it, and then he had put it in mine. I looked ahead. Bert was 20 yards up the road, his silhouette merging with the grey mist, his head down, marching with the same heavy, rhythmic trudge as the rest of us. He didn't look back. He didn't know I knew, or maybe he did. Maybe that was why he hadn't smoked. I shoved the tin back into my pocket, deep down, next to the damp letter. It clinked against the hard biscuit I had saved. Another weight, another thing to carry, another promise to keep for a man who joked about pies and iron rations while the road ate him alive. "Move out, Richards," the sergeant shouted from the rear, his voice sharp with warning. I tightened my grip on the rifle's sling and stepped forward, the tin heavy in my pocket, dragging me down, anchoring me to the man in front who refused to look back. The mist thickened, swallowing the farmhouse, the chickens, and the dry stone trough, leaving only the road and the endless, grinding walk into the north. The strap soared, skin gave way. A hot, sticky wetness spread across my shoulder blade, soaking the wool of my tunic until the fabric rubbed raw meat against raw meat with every lurch of the column. I kept my chin up. To grimace would be to invite the younger lads to look, and if they saw the pain in a veteran's face, their own fragile composure might crack like dry clay under a boot heel. We had marched since dawn, 3 days of this endless retreat from Mons, and the road had become a grey ribbon of misery unspooling into nowhere. My boots felt filled with lead shot. The pack, regulation weight plus the extra biscuits, and the tin of beef tea Aunt Sarah had sent, dug into the spine with a malice that felt personal. It was not just canvas and leather anymore. It was an anchor dragging me back while the world pulled forward. "Keep it moving, Richards. Don't stop to admire the view." Bert's voice came from my left, breathless, but still carrying that forced, brassy cheerfulness that kept the despair at bay for another mile. He was sweating, the grime on his face carved into tracks by the runoff, but he managed a grin that showed too many teeth. "There's no view, Evans," I said, my own voice sounding rough, scraped raw by the dust. "Just mud and your ugly mug." Sentence 1, charmed I'm sure, dialogue. Sentence 2, he shifted his rifle, the sling creaking. Action plus detail. "Eat your iron ration, then." "Saving it for the king's birthday." He laughed, a short, sharp bark that died quickly in the damp air. Though if the king knew what we were eating, he'd likely send us a medal made of the stuff. Ahead, Davies walked alone, slightly apart from the main cluster of our section. He held his Lee Enfield high, careful not to let the muzzle dip into the churned verge, and in his other hand, clutched against his chest, was the small leather book. He wasn't reading it, no, the light was failing, and the jostling of the march made focus impossible, but he held it as if it were a holy relic, shielding it from the drizzle that had begun to mist down, turning the road into a slick, treacherous mirror. A drone started low in the sky, not the wind, mechanical, angry. "Get down," someone screamed, the word tearing through the exhaustion. I dropped, the world tilted. I hit the mud face first, the impact knocking the wind out of me, my rifle skidding away into the ditch. The roar of the engine swept overhead, a monstrous bird of canvas and wire, the black crosses on the wings stark against the grey clouds. The rattle of the machine gun sounded like tearing canvas, ripping through the air, stitching a line of death across the column. Dirt sprayed. A man 2 ranks ahead cried out, a high, thin sound that was cut off abruptly. "Move, get off the road," the sergeant major roared, his voice barely audible over the engine's whine. Chaos, men scrambled for the ditches, slipping on the wet clay, dropping packs, cursing. I shoved myself up, grabbing my rifle, my shoulders screaming as the strap yanked the blistered skin. Bert was beside me, wrestling with his kit, trying to haul his pack into the cover of a hedgerow. He stumbled, his boot catching on a root, and went down hard. Something fell from his tunic pocket, hitting a stone with a bright metallic clink that cut through the din of panic. The tobacco tin. It rolled into the center of the road, brown and dented, catching the last of the daylight. Bert reached for it. His fingers brushed the metal. "Leave it," I yelled, grabbing his tunic and hauling him backward. "The bloody plane's coming round." He hesitated. For a second, just a heartbeat, he looked at the tin, then at me, his eyes wide and hollow. The engine droned again, closer this time, the guns chattering. "Bert, move!" He let go. We scrambled into the ditch, plunging into the cold, sucking mud as the plane swept low, its wheels almost clipping the hedge. Bullets chewed the bank above us, showering us with dirt and shredded leaves. I pressed my face into the slime, tasting earth and old manure, waiting for the tear of metal in flesh. Silence returned, sudden and heavy. The engine faded north. "Check your men," the sergeant bellowed from the road. "Form up, now." We climbed out, slick with mud, gasping. The column was reforming, a ragged line of shaken men checking limbs and rifles. Two lay still in the road, covered quickly by a stretcher-bearer who moved with grim efficiency. Bert stood brushing dirt from his knees, his hands trembling slightly. He patted his pockets, a frantic, jerky motion. Left breast, right breast, empty. He looked at the road. The tin was gone, swallowed by the churned mud or kicked into the ditch by a fleeing boot, invisible now in the gathering gloom. He said nothing, just stared at the spot where it had fallen, his jaw working, then turned away to fall in line. He didn't speak to me. He didn't joke about the pies. He just marched, his shoulders hunched, carrying a weight that wasn't in his pack. Night fell properly then, a thick, suffocating blanket that erased the horizon. We halted in a shallow dip in the land, ordered to rest for an hour before the night march resumed. No fires, no lights, just the sound of men breathing, coughing, and the soft clatter of mess tins. I sat with my back against a bank, pulling my knees up. The pain in my shoulder had dulled to a throbbing ache, a constant reminder of the friction, the sweat, the slow erosion of the body. I reached into my tunic pocket to check the letter from Aunt Sarah, needing the feel of the paper, the connection to Blaina, and the cold dust, and the quiet streets where a man could walk without looking at the sky. My fingers brushed something hard, cold, round. I froze. Slowly I pulled it out. The dim starlight caught the dented surface, players' weights. The lid was askew, just as it had been in the yard. I stared at it. My heart gave a hard, uncomfortable thump against my ribs. Bert had dropped it. I had seen him drop it. I had dragged him away from it. It should be lost in the mud of the road, buried under the boots of 100 retreating men. Unless... I looked across the small circle of resting men to where Bert sat a few yards away, head bowed, as he cleaned his rifle with a rag. He didn't look up, nor did he acknowledge me, yet his hands moved with a deliberate slowness that avoided my gaze. He had slipped it into my pocket when he clapped me on the shoulder, before the whistle, before the plane, when he said, 10 minutes to live like a king. He had known he might not make the next turn, or the next ditch, or the next day, and he had passed the only thing he valued to the one man he trusted to carry it. The tin felt heavy, heavier than lead. It sat in my palm, a small, cold sphere of responsibility. If I opened it, I could smell the tobacco, the scent of home and comfort and normalcy. But I didn't open it. I couldn't. To open it would be to admit he was gone, or that he thought he would be. I shoved it back into the pocket, deep down, next to the letter. It clinked softly against the hard biscuit. Richards. Davies was standing over me, his spectacles reflecting the faint starlight. He held his book closed in one hand. "Are you fit to march?" he asked, his voice quiet, devoid of judgment. "Yes, Corp," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, thick with something I refused to name. "Good, we move in 5. He paused, looking at me, his gaze lingering on my tunic pocket for a fraction of a second before moving to my face. "Keep your head down, Frank. The road is long tonight." He turned and walked away, fading into the shadows of the men forming up. I stood hoisting the pack. The straps bit into the wound, fresh pain flaring, but I ignored it. I adjusted the rifle sling, feeling the hard outline of the tin against my hip, a secret weight, a silent vow. Bert marched ahead, disappearing into the mist, unaware that his treasure was safe, carried by a man who now had 2 reasons to keep walking, 2 burdens to bear, and no way to put either of them down. The order came, whispered down the line. We moved out, stepping into the dark, the mud sucking at our boots, the silence of the lost tin louder than the shells. The post runner stumbled into the yard 10 minutes later, legs pumping like a bellows, face streaked with the same grey mud that coated us all. He didn't stop until he reached the sergeant, dumping a canvas sack onto the trough with a wet thud that sent a splash of dirty water over his puttees. "Post," he gasped, hands on knees, chest heaving under the strap of his rifle. "Only what's marked. Rest burned at HQ." A murmur went through the men, low and hungry, not for food, for names, for proof we still existed somewhere other than this ditch. I stayed where I was, back against the barn wall, watching Davies fold his handkerchief. He didn't look up. Bert, however, shoved off the wheel of the limber and leaned in, elbows digging into his knees. "Come on, then," Bert said, nodding at the sack. "Surely the old girl in Blaina hasn't forgotten her favorite nephew." "Your aunt writes to you?" I asked. "Every week, tells me the price of coal and who's sleeping with the butcher's wife. Vital intelligence, Frank," he grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. The skin around them was tight, pulled by too many days without proper sleep. Nothing from Sarah." "Maybe." I stood up. The movement sent a sharp twinge through my shoulder where the pack strap had rubbed the blister raw hours before. I ignored it. Walking to the trough, I waited while the sergeant tore open the sack and began tossing bundles into the mud. Most went straight into the puddle. Wet cardboard, useless. "Richards." The sergeant held up a package wrapped in brown paper, tied with string that had gone dark with rain, before he tossed it. I caught it against my chest, finding it heavy and solid. "Count yourself lucky," the sergeant muttered, turning back to the sack. "Half the battalion's got nothing but circulars from the Prince of Wales." I carried the parcel back to the bank and sat. Bert was there instantly, hovering like a gull over a chip shop. Davies remained apart, polishing his spectacles again, though they were clean enough already. "Open it," Bert said, urging them not to keep anyone in suspense. "Is it cake? If it's cake, I'm your brother." "Sit down, Evans," Davies said without looking up. "Let the man breathe." "I'm breathing fine, Corp, just anxious." I pulled my knife from my belt. The blade was nicked from opening ration tins, the wood handle swollen with damp. I sawed at the string. It snapped. The paper fell away, revealing a cardboard box underneath, dry and intact. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in shredded newspaper, lay 2 pairs of thick woolen socks, grey, hand-knitted. The stitches were uneven, tight in some places, loose in others, carrying the distinct, uneven tension of Aunt Sarah's needles. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tin of beef tea concentrate and a small packet of tobacco, not the army-issue dust, real leaf. Bert whistled low. "Look at that, proper socks, not the scratchy rubbish they issue us." He reached out, fingers brushing the wool. I slapped his hand away, not hard, just enough. "Easy," I said. "Just feeling the quality, Frank. Don't get stingy." "There for later." "Later," Bert laughed, a dry, barking sound that cut the air. "Look at your boots, mate. The leather's cracking and you've got mud up to your ankles, so put them on." I took the socks out. They smelled of lavender and storage chests, a scent so sharp and domestic it made my teeth ache. It smelled of the parlor in Blaina, of the coal fire that never went out, of safety. I ran my thumb over the heel, thick, warm. "If I wear them now," I said, folding them neatly, "they'll be soaked by evening, ruined, rotting in the boots." "You might not make it to evening," Bert said, the joke landing wrong, a fact he knew instantly as he shifted his weight. His boots scuffed the chalky earth. "Just saying," he added, noting that warm feet keep you moving. "I know." I wrapped the socks back in the oilcloth with the beef tea, refusing to look at Bert because I couldn't. He was right, of course, for cold feet meant trench foot, which meant hospital, and hospital meant going home. Yet something in my gut tightened when I thought of putting them on now, an old and stubborn instinct telling me to hold them back. The air felt different today, heavier, as if the cold wasn't just on the skin, but waiting in the ground and in the wind that whipped across the open field beyond the farmhouse. Saving them for the big freeze, I said. There's always a bigger freeze, Davies murmured. He snapped his spectacles shut and slipped them into his breast pocket. He patted the pocket, ensuring the book was still there beneath the glass. But one must prepare for the winter regardless. Winter's months away, Bert said. It's September. Feels like December, I said. I tucked the box into the bottom of my pack, beneath the spare puttees and the grease tin. I pushed it deep, burying it under the weight of the rest of the kit. It felt like hiding a secret, or a promise. I tightened the straps, feeling the canvas dig into the raw flesh on my shoulder. The pain flared, bright and white, then settled back into the dull throb I was used to. Tea, Bert asked, nodding at the beef tin. Later. Greedy bugger, he leaned back, stretching his legs out. Well, if you won't share, I'll have a smoke. Got a fag left from yesterday. He reached for his pocket, stopped, patted the other side, frowned. Damn, he said, thought I had one. Check the other pocket. Did. He stood up, brushing straw from his trousers. Must have dropped it in the march. No matter, I'll scrounge off Miller. He walked away towards the group of men clustered near the pump, laughing at something a corporal said. I watched him go. He moved with a loose-limbed ease that the rest of us had lost weeks ago. He didn't hunch against the wind. He didn't check his pockets every 5 minutes. He lived in the moment because he couldn't afford to think about the next one. Davies shifted beside me. He pulled a small notebook from his tunic and opened it. The pages were crisp, white, stark against the grime of his uniform. He began to write, pencil scratching softly. You should wear the socks, Frank, he said, not looking at the page. I said I'm saving them. Stubbornness is not a strategy. It's mine. He stopped writing, looked up. His eyes were pale behind the lenses, tired but clear. Just ensure you don't save them until there's no one left to give them to. I didn't answer. I picked up my rifle and checked the bolt. Clean, oiled, ready. A sound cut through the yard chatter, faint at first. A drone, like a motorcar on a distant road, but higher, rougher. Heads turned, men stopped lighting pipes. The laughter near the pump died out. Davies closed his notebook. Aeroplane. Ours, Bert called from the pump. He was holding a cigarette now, unlit, dangling from his lip. Too high, I said. I stood up. The pack felt heavier suddenly, the box of socks adding weight I couldn't explain. And it's coming from the wrong side. The drone grew louder. It wasn't a hum. It was a chatter, an irregular coughing of an engine straining against the sky. I looked up. The clouds were low, grey rags dragging across the sun, but there was a gap, a hole in the overcast. Something speckled the light, black, cross-shaped. Get down, the sergeant screamed. The order didn't travel. It shattered. Men scrambled. Rifles clattered against stone. Bert dropped his cigarette. It landed in the mud, forgotten. I grabbed my pack. The straps slipped on my tunic. I yanked them tight, the buckle biting into my palm. The drone was overhead now, vibrating in the chest, in the teeth, in the soles of the boots. It wasn't just sound, it was pressure. Into the ditch, Davies yelled, grabbing my arm. I didn't move. I looked at Bert. He was standing in the open, looking up, hands shielding his eyes. He wasn't running. He was watching the machine circle back for the second pass. Bert, I shouted. He turned, smiled, reached into his breast pocket. The engine roared. The nose of the plane dipped. I dropped to the mud, pulling Davies with me, the pack slamming against my spine, the box of socks digging into my kidney like a stone. The first burst of fire tore the air above us, stripping leaves from the hedge and turning the dust of the yard into a choking cloud. I pressed my face into the slime, waiting for the tear of metal, the heat, the end. The pack held me down, heavy, full, ready for a winter that might not come. Nib scratched, then stuck. A hard, dry click against the paper. I held the fountain pen closer to the face of my wristwatch, tilting it until the grey light caught the steel point, but the ink had seized in the feed, thickened by the cold into a sludge that refused to flow. Outside the ditch, the rain had stopped an hour ago, yet the water level rose anyway, seeping through the canvas of my trousers until the wool sat heavy and sodden against my thighs. leaching the heat from my bones with a slow, patient greed. Damn thing, I muttered, shaking the pen. A single drop of black fell, blooming on the wet page like a bruise. The smell hit me first, before the sight of it. Wet wool, yes, the pervasive stench of 1,000 men drying their kits over foul-smelling fires, but underneath that, sharper and more immediate, was the scent of the Marne itself. Churned earth, horse manure, and the copper tang of old blood that never quite washed out of the mud, no matter how hard the rain tried to scrub it clean. It clung to the back of the throat, a taste you swallowed with every breath, mixing with the ration tea until the whole world felt like a tin pot left boiling too long on a stove. I wiped the nib on my tunic sleeve, leaving a dark smear against the khaki, and tried again. The paper was soft, pulpy from the damp air, threatening to tear under the pressure of the nib. Dearest Aunt Sarah, the weather here is much the same as Blaina, though I dare say your fire burns brighter than anything we have managed to find. I stopped, the lie sat on the page, stark and foolish. My hand cramped, fingers stiff and blue-tinged, curling around the barrel of the pen until the knuckles turned white. There was no fire here. There was only the ditch, dug hurriedly into the bank of the river, its sides collapsing in soft slumps whenever a heavy boot scraped against them. The water lapped at my boots, finding the gaps in the leather where the dubbin had worn away, soaking the socks beneath. I could feel the cold creeping up my shins, a numbness that started in the toes and worked its way upward, slowing the blood, slowing the thoughts. Behind me, someone coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook the whole frame of the man holding it. Frank. I didn't turn, I knew the voice. Davies. He was sitting further up the slope, where the ground was slightly higher, his back against the muddy wall, a book open on his knees. He wasn't reading it. He was just holding it there, protecting the pages from the drift of mist that curled along the trench floor like smoke. Still writing? He asked. His voice was quiet, devoid of the strain that edged everyone else's tone. Trying to, I said. Ink's frozen. Rub it between your palms, warm the barrel. I have. I rubbed the pen between my hands, feeling the cold metal resist the heat of my skin. It was a futile gesture, like trying to warm a stone in a snowstorm, but I did it anyway. The motion felt domestic, absurdly out of place in this waterlogged scrape in the French countryside. In Blaina, Sarah would be sitting by the hearth now, the coal fire roaring, the kettle singing. She would have her knitting needles clicking, a rhythm as steady as a clock, while she waited for the postman. The miners are still out, she had written last time. The trains aren't running past Merthyr, so the parcels are delayed. Don't worry about the socks, I'll send them when the lines clear. She didn't know the lines wouldn't clear in time. She didn't know that by the time those socks arrived, the frost would have already set in deep, turning the mud to iron and the men to statues. I looked down at the letter again. The words swam before my eyes, blurry and indistinct. We are moving again soon. The Germans are pressing hard, but we hold them. Another lie, we weren't holding anyone. We were falling back, step by bloody step, leaving behind the dead we couldn't carry and the equipment that slowed us down. The pack on my back felt heavier today than it had at Mons, not because of the weight of the canvas or the rations inside, but because of what I had added to it yesterday. Bert's tobacco tin, dented and empty, and the small, leather-bound book Davies had lent me, filled with poems he claimed helped him sleep. I couldn't leave them. To drop them would be to admit they were gone, that the men who owned them were nothing more than names on a list typed out in some office in London. So I carried them. They dug into my spine with every step, a constant, physical reminder of the spaces where friends used to walk. Read it to me, Davies said. I looked up. He had closed his book now, resting his hands on the cover. His spectacles were fogged with condensation, obscuring his eyes, but I could see the curve of his mouth, the faint, tired smile that never quite reached his cheeks. It's nothing, I said, just telling her the weather is fine. She knows it isn't fine, Frank. She's not a fool. She's my aunt. She needs to think I'm safe. Davies sighed, a soft exhalation that vanished instantly in the damp air. Safety is a luxury we can't afford to write home about. It makes the truth harder to bear when it comes. I capped the pen. The ink was useless now, a solid block in the reservoir. I shoved the pen into my breast pocket next to the photograph of Sarah's house, the one she had sent last Christmas. The metal was cold against my chest, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the pocket where I kept the tobacco tin. "Where's Bert?" I asked. Davies nodded towards the rear of the ditch. "Sleeping, or pretending to. He's been joking about his mother's pies for an hour, said if he survives this, he'll eat nothing but pastry for a month." "He always says that." "Yes, and he always survives long enough to eat them." The certainty in his voice was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river. We both knew the odds. We had seen the gaps in the line grow wider with every mile we retreated, the faces around the fire fewer, the laughter thinner, but we didn't speak of it. To speak of it was to invite it in, to let the reality of the slaughter breach the defenses we had built out of routine and dark humor. A shell landed somewhere distant to the east. The sound was muffled by the rain and the distance, a dull thud that vibrated through the ground rather than the air. No one flinched. We had learned to distinguish the ones that mattered from the ones that were just noise. This one was noise, a warning shot, or perhaps just waste ammunition fired by a gunner who couldn't see his target. "The post didn't come," I said. "No. 4 days now. The roads are bad. The wagons get stuck." "It's not the roads, Davies. You know it isn't." He didn't answer. He just looked down at his boots, submerged in the grey slurry that filled the bottom of the trench. The water rippled as a rat swam past, its nose twitching above the surface, indifferent to the men sitting in the filth around it. The creature scrambled up the bank, disappearing into a hole beneath a root, carrying with it a scrap of biscuit someone had dropped. "I tore up the last letter," I said, "couldn't finish it. The words felt hollow." "Better that than a lie," Davies murmured, "though I suspect Sarah prefers the lies. They keep her warm at night." I leaned my head back against the mud wall. The earth was cold, sucking the heat from my skull, but I didn't move. The exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on my eyelids, urging me to sleep, to let the cold take me for a while. But I couldn't, not yet, not while the silence stretched out, taut and waiting. The silence of the post was worse than the shelling. When the shells fell, you knew where you stood. You knew the danger was real, tangible, something you could duck from or run towards. But the silence was an absence. It was the space where news should be, where comfort should arrive, and its emptiness filled the trench with a pressure that made the ears ring. Men stopped talking. They stopped cleaning their rifles. They just sat, staring down the length of the ditch, watching the road that led back to the rear, waiting for the sound of wheels that didn't come. A figure emerged from the mist at the far end of the line. A runner, his uniform caked in mud, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with a limp, favoring his left leg, his face pale and drawn, heads lifted, shoulders straightened. The sudden movement rippled down the line like a wave, a collective intake of breath that held more hope than prayer. The runner stopped at the first group, pulling envelopes from the bag. Names were called out, snatched at, torn open. The rustle of paper was loud in the quiet ditch, a sound of life amidst the decay. "Miller. Here. Jones. Ile." The runner moved closer, his eyes sweeping across the list pinned to the inside of the bag flap. He stopped in front of our section. I felt my heart kick against my ribs, a sudden, violent thump that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the desperate, starving need for a word from home. "Davies," the runner said, handing over a thick, cream-colored envelope. Davies took it with trembling hands, tucking it inside his tunic without opening it. He nodded his thanks, his eyes bright behind the fogged lenses. The runner looked at the list again. He ran a muddy finger down the names, paused, looked up. "Richards." "Here," I said, my voice cracking. I stood up, the water sloshing in my boots. "I'm here." The runner shook his head. He dug into the bottom of the bag, pulling out a single, slender slip of paper. It wasn't an envelope. It was a form, printed on stiff card, the edges crisp and dry against the wet surroundings. "Nothing for you, mate," he said, his voice flat, devoid of apology. "Just this, for the company clerk. Says it's for a Thomas in the next platoon, deceased." He held out the slip. I stared at it. The word deceased was typed in bold, black letters, stark and final. It wasn't for me. It wasn't for Davies. It was for a man I barely knew, a quiet fellow from Swansea who played the harmonica in the evenings. But the slip might as well have had my name on it. The randomness of it, the casual way the runner handed over the notice of a life ended, struck me harder than any shell burst. I took the slip. The card was cold in my hand. "Tell the clerk," the runner said, already turning away, moving down the line to the next group. "He needs to sign for it." I stood there, the card clutched in my fist, the mud sucking at my boots as I shifted my weight. Davies was opening his letter now, the paper crackling softly, a sound of domestic normalcy that seemed to belong to another world entirely. I looked down at the slip in my hand, then at the unfinished letter in my lap, the ink frozen solid, the words half-formed and useless. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, filling the ditch, filling my lungs, pressing against the pack on my shoulders, until I thought my knees would buckle under the weight of all the things I couldn't say, and all the names I couldn't forget. Davies tore the envelope. The sound ripped through the damp air, sharp as a knife on a whetstone. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Even here, with the mud climbing his puttees and the smell of rotting sandbags thick in the throat, he treated the post like a Sunday service. He unfolded the single sheet of paper, smoothing the creases with a thumb that shook slightly, not from cold, but from a terrible, starving reverence. "Read it," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone standing further down the trench, someone who hadn't just been handed a death notice for a stranger. "Go on, don't make me wait." Davies adjusted his spectacles. The lenses were fogged again, a milky film that hid his eyes, but I knew he was sweeping his gaze across the lines, hunting for the specific cadence of home. "She says the coal strike has halted the trains at Blaina," he read, his voice low, steady, fighting to keep the tremor out of it. "No parcels can get through until the miners return to the pits. She apologizes for the socks, says she'll send them the moment the wheels turn." "Socks," Bert muttered from the shadows of the dugout entrance. He was sharpening a bayonet on a brick, the scrape, 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 a rhythmic counterpoint to Davies's reading. "Tell her to keep the bloody socks. Send tobacco. Send a bottle of rum that isn't watered down with formaldehyde. Send anything that burns." "She says the chapel bell is working again," Davies continued, ignoring Bert, his eyes fixed on the ink. "And that Mrs. Gable's cat has had kittens, 3 of them, all black." "Black cats," Bert said. He stopped scraping. He held the bayonet up to the grey light, testing the edge with a thumb that came away red. "Bad luck that, or good, depending on which way they walk. Tell your aunt to send the cats. We could use the luck." Davies folded the letter. He tucked it back into the envelope, then into the inner pocket of his tunic, right over his heart. The gesture was automatic, practiced, a ritual performed 1,000 times before this war started and 1,000 times since. He looked at me, and for a second, the fog on his glasses cleared enough to show the exhaustion beneath. "She asks after you, Frank, wants to know if the damp is playing up with your old injury." "Tell her I'm dancing," I said. "Tell her I'm leading the waltz in the mud." "I won't tell her that." "Then tell her nothing. Tell her the post is slow. Tell her the trains are stuck. It's all the same, isn't it?" I looked down at the card in my hand. The word deceased seemed to have grown larger, the black ink bleeding into the fibers of the card, spreading like a stain. "Thomas." I tried to picture him, a face maybe, a voice. But all I could see was the harmonica, the cheap tin thing he used to play "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," when the rations were short and the mood was darker than the night. He was gone, just like that. A slip of card, a signature from a clerk, and a man ceased to exist in the ledger of the living. Bert spat into the trench water. The globule landed with a soft plop, sinking instantly into the grey sludge. "Thomas, was it?" he asked. He didn't look up from his bayonet. Quiet lad, played that tune until his lips bled. I said, "Thomas." "Pity," Bert said, just that, one word, no flourish, no eulogy. In this place, pity was a luxury we couldn't afford to spend on everyone. We saved it for the ones we loved, and even then we rationed it. Well, one less mouth to feed, one less share of the bully beef. "Shut up, Bert," Davies said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Bert flinch just slightly. "Show some respect." "Respect doesn't fill the belly, Corp," Bert replied, but he stopped sharpening the blade. He wiped the metal on his trouser leg, leaving a smear of oil and rust. And it doesn't bring the post wagon. 4 days. Christ, you'd think the Kaiser had bought the horses. The roads are gone, Davies said. The rain, it eats the ground, turns it to soup. The wagons sink, you know how it is. I know how it is, Bert snapped. He stood up, stretching his back until it cracked, a series of small, dry pops that sounded like rifle fire in miniature. I know that 4 days without a word from my mother feels like 4 years. I know that every time a runner comes down the line, my stomach turns over like a churn. And I know that if I don't get a smoke soon, I'm going to shoot the next rat that looks at me funny. He reached into his tunic pocket, fishing for a crumb of tobacco, a scrap of something to roll. His fingers came out empty. He stared at his hand, then at me. The joke died in his eyes, replaced by a sudden, stark vulnerability that he tried to mask with a grin. It didn't work. The grin was too tight, the eyes too wide. "Got any, Frank?" he asked. "Just a pinch for the road." I shook my head. My own pocket was empty, save for the frozen pen and the half-finished letter that was now useless. Nothing, dry as a bone. Bert nodded. He didn't argue. He just turned back to the dugout, his shoulders hunched against the cold, against the silence, against the weight of the pack that none of us could take off. "Right then," he said, "back to the waiting game." Davies leaned closer to me. He smelled of wet wool and the faint, sweet scent of the paper he carried, the only clean thing in the trench. "She says the strike will end soon," he whispered, so Bert wouldn't hear. "She says the men are hungry too, that they'll come back to the pits." "Will they?" I asked. "I don't know." He looked at the card in my hand. "But she believes it. That's what matters. She believes that the trains will run and the socks will come and that we'll be warm again. And if they don't, then she believes that until she can't." He touched my arm, a brief, solid pressure. "We have to let her believe it, Frank. It's the only thing keeping her warm. And if she's warm, maybe some of it reaches us. Maybe." I looked at the card again. Deceased. The word was absolute. It allowed for no belief, no hope, no trains running or socks arriving. It was a full stop in a sentence that had no end. I crumpled the card in my fist. The paper resisted, stiff and unyielding, then gave way with a harsh crunch. I shoved it into my pocket, next to the frozen pen, next to the nothingness. "Frank," Davies said. I looked up. The runner was coming back. He had finished the rest of the line, his bag lighter now, his limp more pronounced. He stopped in front of us, breathing hard, steam rising from his mouth in thick white clouds. He looked at me, then at Davies, then at the empty space where Bert had been standing. "Clark wants that slip signed," the runner said. He jerked his chin towards the card in my pocket. "Now, before he moves the wagon." "I'll take it," I said. My legs felt heavy, as if the mud had seeped into my bones, turning them to lead. I pushed myself off the fire step, the water in my boots sloshing with a sickening squelch. "I'll take it to him." "Don't be long," Davies said. "Roll call in 10, and Frank." I paused, looking back at him. He was holding his letter again, clutching it like a talisman, like a shield against the grey world. "Yes." "Tell the clerk," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind picking up in the wire above. "Tell him to check the list again, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case he missed a name." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. The silence between us filled with the unspoken fear, the lottery of survival that had spared me today but might not tomorrow. "Just in case," he repeated. I nodded. I turned and started down the trench, the mud sucking at my boots with every step, pulling me back, trying to hold me in the ditch with the rest of the dead and the waiting. The card in my pocket felt heavy, heavier than the pack, heavier than the rifle slung over my shoulder. It was a small thing, a slip of paper, but it carried the weight of everything we were losing, everything we couldn't save, everything that was waiting for us at the end of the line. The Clark's dugout was 50 yards down, hidden behind a collapse of sandbags and a tangle of barbed wire. I could see the lantern flickering inside, a lonely yellow eye in the gloom. I walked towards it, one foot after the other, fighting the mud, fighting the cold, fighting the silence that threatened to swallow me whole. I had a signature to give, a death to confirm. And then maybe, just maybe, I could find a dry patch of earth to sit on and try to write a letter that didn't taste like ash in my mouth. But first the clerk, first the signature, first the official acknowledgement that Thomas was gone and that the world kept turning, indifferent and cruel, around his absence. I reached the entrance to the dugout, the flap hanging loose in the wind. I pushed it aside and stepped into the dark. The lantern's smoke hit me first, a thick, oily fog that tasted of paraffin and damp canvas, coating the back of my throat before my eyes could adjust to the gloom. Inside, the dugout was a cave of wet earth, the walls weeping slow, grey tears that pooled on the floorboards before seeping into the cracks between them. The clerk sat hunched over a crate used as a desk, his tunic unbuttoned at the collar despite the cold, a streak of ink smeared across his cheekbone like a bruise. He didn't look up when I entered, just kept scratching his pen against the paper, the sound harsh and dry, like a rat gnawing on bone. "Richards," he said, not lifting his head, "took your time." "Mud's deep near the second bay," I said. My voice sounded flat in the small space, swallowed by the wool and the wet. "Boots stuck." "Everyone's boots are stuck." He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, lacking any spark of recognition or pity. He held out a hand, palm up, waiting. "The slip. Let's have it. Wagons hitched and the mules are spooked by the shelling up on the ridge. We move in 5. I reached into my pocket. The crumpled card felt hot against my fingers, damp with sweat despite the chill. I pulled it out, the paper stiff and jagged where I'd crushed it, and laid it on the crate beside his ledger. The word "deceased" stared up at us, black and final against the grey pulp of the form. The clerk picked it up, smoothed it out with a thumb that trembled slightly, and dipped his pen into the inkwell. The ink was thick, almost frozen, and he had to jab the nib hard to get it to flow, leaving a blot that spread like a bruise over the date. "Thomas," he murmured, writing the name. "J. Thomas, 4th Company, correct." "That's the one." He wrote faster now, the scratch of the pen filling the silence, a frantic, scratching rhythm that seemed to echo the nervous tapping of his foot against the crate leg. "Right, signed." He pushed the ledger towards me, the page filled with rows of names, some crossed out with a single violent stroke, others left blank where the ink had run dry. Bottom line, sign next to the date. I took the pen. It was cold, the metal biting into my numb fingers, and the ink on the nib was clotted. I pressed down, forcing a line onto the page, my signature a jagged scrawl that barely resembled the name I'd been given. Richards. FP. The letters looked foreign, like something written by a stranger in a hurry to leave. I handed the pen back. The clerk didn't thank me. He just closed the ledger with a thud that sent a small cloud of dust rising from the cover, settling on his tunic like grey snow. "Done," he said. He reached under the crate and pulled out a canvas sack, heavy and bulging, tied at the top with a frayed string. Post came in with the rations, late, as usual. He tossed the sack onto the crate between us. It landed with a dull thud, the sound of wet paper and heavy canvas colliding. "Sort it yourself. I've got the roll to finish before the officer comes down." I stared at the sack. For a second my hands wouldn't move. They hung at my sides, useless, as if the cold had locked the joints. Then slowly I reached out and grabbed the string, my fingers fumbling with the knot. It was tight, swollen with damp, and I had to pick at it with my thumbnail until it gave way with a sudden snap. I pulled the top open. The smell hit me then, distinct and sharp amidst the rot of the dugout, the scent of dry paper, of home, of Blainer. It smelled of coal dust and baking bread, and the lavender soap Sarah used to keep the moths out of her woolens. It was a smell that didn't belong here, a smell that made my stomach turn over with a violent, hollow ache. I reached in, my hand brushing against envelopes of different sizes and textures. Thick cream paper from the officers' wives, thin blue aerograms from the boys in the depot, official brown wrappers marked with the War Office seal. I dug deeper, pushing the letters aside, feeling for the specific texture of Sarah's handwriting, the way she formed her R's with a sharp, upward flick. Nothing. I pulled my hand out, empty. I looked at the clerk, who was busy tallying rations of bully beef, his lips moving silently as he counted. "Anything else?" I asked. My voice was too loud, too hopeful. It cracked on the last word. The clerk paused, his pencil hovering over the ledger. He didn't look at me. "Bag's empty, Richards. What you see is what you got, unless you think I'm holding out on you." "No," I shoved my hand back into the sack, scrabbling blindly, turning the letters over, checking the bottom, the corners, the seams. Just to check again, please, Sarah Richards, Blaina, Monmouthshire. She sends every week. I told you. He snapped the ledger shut, the sound like a gunshot in the small space. Bags empty. Maybe the strike held up the post in Wales. Maybe the train never left the station. Or maybe, he added, his voice dropping to a flat, weary monotone, maybe she stopped writing. Happens more than you'd think. Folks get tired of sending words into the dark. She wouldn't stop. The words came out sharp, defensive. I pulled my hand from the sack, clutching a handful of letters that weren't mine. She promised. Promises don't travel well in this weather, Private. He stood up, grabbing his cap from the hook on the wall. He jammed it onto his head, pulling the brim low over his eyes. Take the bag, sort it outside. I'm locking up. I stood there holding the sack, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. It wasn't heavier, just a few pounds of paper and news from a world that felt 1,000 miles away, but it dragged at my arms, pulling my shoulders down. I turned and walked out of the dugout, pushing through the flap into the grey twilight. The wind had picked up, whipping the rain into my face, stinging my eyes, but I barely felt it. I walked back up the trench, the mud sucking at my boots, each step a struggle, a fight against the ground that wanted to keep me. Davies was waiting where I'd left him, huddled against the parapet, his collar turned up against the drizzle. Bert was beside him, lighting a match against the sole of his boot, the flare brief and orange in the gloom before it died, leaving the smell of sulfur hanging in the air. They both looked at me as I approached, their faces pale and drawn in the failing light. Well, Bert asked. He tossed the dead match into the mud, where it hissed and vanished. Did she write? Did the old girl send the socks? I stopped in front of them. The sack hung from my hand, limp and useless. I looked at Davies, who was watching me with those quiet, intelligent eyes, waiting for the news that would keep his own mother hopeful. I looked at Bert, whose grin was already forming, ready to deflect whatever bad news I carried with a joke about missing parcels or lazy postmen. No, I said, the word felt like a stone in my mouth. Nothing for me. Bert's grin faltered, then vanished. He kicked at the mud with his toe, dislodging a clump that slid back into the trench with a wet slap. Bloody strike, he muttered. Stupid miners, can't they see we are freezing out here? Maybe next week, Davies said softly. He reached out and touched my arm again, the same brief, solid pressure as before. The trains will run soon, Frank. You know Sarah, she won't give up. I know. I shifted the sack to my other hand, the canvas rough against my palm. I know she won't. But as I spoke, I felt the weight of the empty space where her letter should have been, a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with hunger or cold. It was a silence louder than the shelling, a gap in the world that no amount of belief could fill. I looked down the line of the trench, towards the darkening sky, towards the place where the post wagon had disappeared hours ago. The road was gone, swallowed by the mud, and the silence was closing in, step by step, boot by boot, until there was nothing left but the waiting. Roll call, Davies said, checking his watch, the glass face cracked and fogged. Best get in line. I nodded. I slung the sack over my shoulder, adding it to the pack, to the rifle, to the weight of the dead man's name in my pocket. We fell in, a ragged line of shadows against the grey, waiting for our names to be called, waiting for the next letter, waiting for the end of the silence that was already starting to drown us all. Clay stuck to the shovel blade like wet wool, thick and grey, refusing to scrape off no matter how hard I raked the edge against my boot heel. We had been digging since dawn, carving a latrine trench behind the support line where the ground felt soft, too soft, as if the soil itself wanted to swallow us whole before the Germans got the chance. My shoulders burned, a deep, grinding ache that started at the neck and ran down to the small of my back. Amplified by the weight of the pack, I refused to take off even for this. Regulations said we could stack kits during fatigues, but I kept mine on, straps digging into the blisters from Mons, because taking it off felt like admitting we were staying, and staying meant dying in one spot instead of moving. Shift it, Richards. Sergeant Evans's voice cut through the mist, sharp and impatient. King's shilling didn't pay you to lean on that handle. I spat into the hole, just catching my breath. Sarge, unlike some, I'm not built of iron. None of us are, he muttered, kicking a clod of earth that landed with a wet slap near Bert's feet. But the king doesn't care about your constitution. Dig. Bert laughed, a rough, barking sound that seemed too loud for the quiet morning. He was working the other end of the trench, his movements jerky with exhaustion, yet he still found energy to mock the rhythm of our labor. Iron, I'm made of Welsh coal dust and mother's pastry, Sarge. You break me, you'll find nothing but crumbs inside. Then crumble faster, Evans said, turning away to inspect a sandbag wall that looked solid enough to stop a bullet, or at least pretend to. I lifted the shovel again. The clay made a sucking noise as I pulled it free, a wet, tearing sound like flesh separating from bone, and for a second I thought I might drop the tool right there and sleep standing up, my forehead resting against the cold wood of the handle while the world spun slowly around me. Men were doing it further down the line, heads nodding, eyes sliding shut while their bodies stayed upright, propped by rifles or trench walls, caught in that grey space between waking and dreaming where the war couldn't quite reach them. I envied them. Sleep felt like a luxury we hadn't earned, a debt we owed to a bank that had already collapsed. Davies sat on a fire step nearby, cleaning his spectacles with a handkerchief that had seen better days, the fabric grey with grime and grease. He wasn't digging. His rank spared him the worst of the fatigues, but he looked more tired than any of us, his face pale and drawn, shadows pooling under his eyes like bruises. He held his poetry book closed in his lap, fingers tracing the cover without opening it, as if afraid the words inside might escape and vanish into the mud. "You're quiet today, Corporal," Bert called out, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow with a sleeve that was already stiff with dried mud. "No verses for the latrine crew, something about daffodils to lift our spirits." Davies looked up, blinking as he slid the glasses back onto his nose. "Not today, Evans. The lights poor for reading." "It's mid-morning," I said, driving the shovel down again, feeling the jar run up my arms. "Light's fine." "Not for reading," he repeated softly, turning his gaze back to the closed book. "Some things require a clearer eye than I possess." I didn't press him. Since we'd stopped retreating and started digging in near Ypres, Davies had changed, shrinking into himself like a snail retreating into a shell that offered no real protection. He used to read aloud in the evenings, his voice steady and clear, reciting lines that made the trench feel less like a grave and more like a room, however temporary. Now the book stayed shut, tucked inside his tunic pocket next to his heart, a secret he kept from the rest of us. I understood the impulse. Some truths were too heavy to speak, better carried in silence than shared and broken apart by the wind. My own pocket felt heavy too. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was Bert's tobacco tin, the one he'd lost 3 days ago during the scramble at the bridge, and I'd picked up without thinking. He hadn't noticed it missing yet, too busy joking about the lack of post and the quality of the rations, but I knew he'd miss it eventually, when the craving hit hard and his fingers went searching for the familiar round shape. I could have given it back, should have. But holding it felt like holding a piece of him, a tangible proof that he was still here, still laughing, still making bad jokes about pastry while we dug holes for our own waste. If I gave it back, the connection snapped, and we were just two men in a muddy ditch again, waiting for the next shell. "Frank," Bert leaned on his shovel, breathing hard, his chest heaving under the tunic. "You heard from Sarah yet? The post wagon came in early." "No," I kept digging, focusing on the rhythm, the lift, the turn, the dump. "Nothing." "Strange," he frowned, a crease appearing between his eyebrows that made him look older, less like the boy who'd joined up in August. "She writes like clockwork. My mum sent a parcel last week, said she'd included a tin of ginger biscuits. Maybe they're holding it back at the depot." "Maybe," I said, though I knew better. The silence from Blaina wasn't about biscuits or delays, it was about the strikes, the trains stopping, the world back home grinding to a halt just as ours had. But telling Bert that wouldn't help. He needed the lie, the hope that the post was just late, not lost. "Tell you what," Bert said, straightening up, a spark returning to his eyes. "Tonight, I'm going over. There's a German listening post 200 yards out near that copse. Bet they've got tobacco, better than this rotten stuff we're issued." "You're mad," Davies said, looking up from his book. "It's suicide." "It's resourcefulness," Bert corrected, grinning now, the old bravado snapping back into place like a mask. Besides, I need to test if the Bosch run as fast as the miners when startled. My money's on the miners, but I'd like to be sure. Don't do it, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Not for tobacco. Bert winked, picking up his shovel again. Too late, mate. Promise made to myself. Besides, someone needs to keep the supply lines open. Can't have the battalion drying out before Christmas. He resumed digging, humming a tuneless song under his breath, oblivious to the way Davies watched him, or the way my grip tightened on the shovel handle until my knuckles turned white. The clay felt heavier now, dragging at the blade, resisting every movement, as if the ground itself knew what Bert was planning and wanted to hold him back. I looked at the tobacco tin in my mind's eye, round and dented, sitting in my pocket against my hip, a weight I'd chosen to carry. Right, Evans barked, clapping his hands together. That's enough for now. Fall in for inspection. Clean those shovels before you stack them. We moved slowly, stiffly, muscles protesting as we straightened up. I scraped the clay from my blade, the metal ringing against the wood, a hollow sound that echoed in the quiet trench. As I turned to stack the tool, I felt the tin shift in my pocket, a small, hard reminder of the promise I hadn't made but was keeping anyway. Bert was already walking ahead, whistling, heading towards the parapet where the wire gleamed dull silver in the grey light. He didn't look back. None of us did. We just fell in line, waiting for the next order, the next move, the next silence to break. And somewhere out there, beyond the wire, the Germans were digging too, building their own walls, waiting for us to make the first mistake. Dusk settled like a bruise. The light drained from the sky, leaving the trench walls slick and black, reflecting the faint glow of a cigarette tip further down the line. Cold bit through the wool tunic, finding the gaps where buttons had popped or fabric had worn thin. I shifted my weight, boots scraping against the duckboards, trying to find a spot that didn't leak water. Bert stood near the firing step, checking the bayonet on his rifle for the third time. He didn't need the rifle. He was going over with a knife and a sack, but the ritual mattered. Steel needed polishing. Hands needed something to do. "You sure about this?" I asked. The words hung in the damp air, useless. "Course I'm sure," Bert grinned, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. They were fixed on the wire, where the twisted metal caught the last of the twilight. "Be back before supper. Save me a bit of that bully beef if it arrives." "There isn't any bully beef." "Then save me the tin." He slipped over the parapet without a sound. One moment he was there, a solid shape against the earthworks, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of no man's land. I watched the spot where he'd vanished until my eyes watered from the strain. Davies sat beside me, cleaning his spectacles with a rag that was dirtier than the lenses. He rubbed in circles, slow and methodical, as if polishing could restore clarity to a world gone mad. "He'll come back," Davies said. "He'd better." I reached into my pocket. The tobacco tin sat there, cold against my thigh. Metal holds the chill longer than flesh. I wrapped my fingers around it, feeling the dents where Bert had dropped it on the stone floor of a barn near Mons. If he didn't return, the tin stayed with me. A souvenir, a weight. I pushed it deeper into the lining, hiding it from the damp, hiding it from myself. Minutes dragged. The trench quieted, men huddling in dugouts or leaning against the clay, listening, not for shells, for the sound of a man running, for the rattle of wire, for the shot that means a raid has gone wrong. A rat scuttled along the fire step, bold in the darkness, sniffing at a crust of bread left by a careless hand. I kicked at it. The animal froze, whiskers twitching, then vanished into a hole beneath a sandbag. 20 minutes, Davies murmured. Too long. Or too short. He put the spectacles back on, squinting into the gloom. The book remained inside his tunic, a lump against his ribs. He hadn't taken it out all day. Since Nonni Bostion, since the shelling started, the poetry had dried up. Words cost too much energy now. Better to save breath for breathing. A scrape of boot on earth came from the parapet. I grabbed my rifle, shoulder muscling the wood stock up, finger hovering near the trigger guard. Davies stiffened, rag still in hand. "Easy," a voice whispered from above. "It's only me." Bert dropped into the trench, landing heavy on the duckboards. He smelled of wet earth and cordite, a sharp metallic tang that strung the nose. A line of red scored his left cheek, raw and weeping, cutting through the grime like a fresh plough furrow. He didn't touch it. He held up the sack, grinning wide now, the fear gone, replaced by the adrenaline buzz of survival. "Told you," he said. "You're bleeding." Scratch wire caught me coming back. He loosened the sack strings and pulled out 2 tins, dark and unmarked. "German issue, strong stuff, smells like old boots but it'll burn." Davies leaned forward, inspecting the wound. "Needs iodine." "Needs a drink." Bert tossed 1 tin to me. I caught it, the metal cold and heavy. "Share that out, make it last." "Did they see you?" I asked. "Probably didn't stick around for tea." He wiped his cheek with the back of a gloved hand, smearing the blood into the dirt. "Fast little buggers, though, scuttled off into their holes like rabbits. Reminded me of the miners back home when the whistle blows for shift change. Only difference is the miners don't shoot at you." He laughed, a loud, barking sound that echoed off the trench walls. Men nearby turned to look, then turned back away. Laughter was dangerous. It invited attention. I pocketed the tobacco tin, feeling the weight of both now, one given, one kept. The duplication felt wrong, like carrying a ghost in each pocket. "Keep your voice down," Davies warned. "Let them hear." Bert leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the duckboards. "Let them know we're still here, still breathing." I looked at the cut on his face. It wasn't a scratch. It was deep enough to stitch, though none of us had thread for skin. The blood had stopped flowing, clotted dark in the cold air. He trembled, just slightly, a shiver running through his frame that he tried to mask by lighting a cigarette with a match cupped in both hands. The flare illuminated the hollows under his eyes, the grey tint to his skin that no amount of boasting could hide. "Sarah still writing?" he asked, smoke curling from his lips. "No. Strange. She's busy. Strikes. Likely." He nodded, accepting the lie. We all knew the posts were erratic, trains halted, lines cut. But admitting the silence was permanent felt like admitting the end. Better to say she was busy. Better to say the post was late. "Tell her I said hello," Bert said. "Tell her I've got German tobacco now. International trade." "I'll tell her." I pulled my notebook from my tunic. The pages were damp, swollen at the edges. I smoothed one flat against my knee, the paper rough under my palm. Pen ink was thick in the cold, needing warmth to flow. I held the nib over the page, waiting for the words to form. "Dear Aunt Sarah, the sector is quiet today." A lie. 3 men had died this morning, heads popped like corks by a sniper who knew our routine. I wrote the lie anyway. The pen scratched, leaving a thin blue line that looked too bright against the grey paper. Bert was humming again, a tuneless fragment of a song about a girl in Cardiff, eyes closed, letting the tobacco smoke fill his lungs. Davies had opened his book, though he wasn't reading, just staring at the print, as if memorizing the shape of the letters. I pressed the pen harder. "We are well fed, and the weather is holding." Another lie. The mud was up to our knees, the rations rotten, the cold seeping into bone. But she didn't need the truth. She needed to know I was alive. The rest was detail, clutter that could be discarded. I glanced at Bert, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand rested near the knife at his belt even in sleep. "Frank." I stopped writing. The ink pooled at the nib, a dark drop ready to fall. Outside the trench, a flare went up, hissing as it climbed, casting a magnesium-white light over the wire and the bodies hidden in the grass. The shadow of the trench jumped, sharp and sudden. Bert didn't wake. Davies closed his book. I capped the pen. The click sounded loud in the sudden quiet. Something was coming. The air felt heavier, charged like the moment before a storm breaks, though the sky was clear. I tucked the notebook away, next to the tobacco tin, next to the weight I couldn't put down. Bert shifted in his sleep, mumbling something about pies, about a train schedule, about a grave in Wales that needed tending. I waited for the sound. The ink had seized. A black clot sat on the nib, useless as a stone. I wiped it on my thumb, the stain spreading into the creases of my skin, and shoved the notebook back inside my tunic. It landed with a soft thud against the 2 tins of tobacco, one for Bert, one for me, or one for the grave if the post never ran again. The weight settled low in my gut, a cold anchor dragging at the diaphragm. Quiet sector, Bert murmured, eyes still shut. He wasn't asleep, just resting the bones. That's what you told her, isn't it? Yes. Good girl, Sarah always did like a tidy story. He shifted, the leather of his belt creaking as he adjusted his position on the duckboards. Tell her I'm fat on bully beef. Tell her I've put on a stone since leaving Blainer. Your skin and bone, Bert. Details, he waved a hand, dismissing the truth with a flick of the wrist. She doesn't need the measurements. She needs the picture of me sitting by the fire, complaining about the mother's cooking. Keep the picture clean, Frank, that's the job. Davies snapped his book shut. The sound was sharp, a crack of wood on wood that made me flinch. He stood up, knees popping, and brushed the damp earth from his trousers. His movements were stiff, deliberate, as if every joint required oiling. He looked at Bert, then at me, his face a mask of exhausted patience. We are not fat, Davies said, and we are not safe. The sniper took Jenkins at 8, Evans at 9, and the boy from Merthyr before breakfast, 3 names before the sun cleared the trees. Bert opened one eye. Jenkins was careless, stuck his head up like a meerkat. Evans was digging a latrine, Davies countered, his voice rising, tight with a frustration he usually kept buried under layers of politeness. The boy was fetching water. Carelessness had nothing to do with it. The Germans know our patterns. They know when we piss and when we drink. So we change the pattern. We can't change the pattern if we are weighed down by nonsense. Davies stepped closer, looming over me where I sat. He pointed a gloved finger at my chest, at the bulge beneath the wool. That tin, you've got 2 now. Why? It's tobacco. It's lead, Davies spat. Every ounce counts when you have to run. When the order comes to move, or to dive, or to climb out of this hole, that extra weight will slow you. A second is all it takes. A single second of hesitation because your legs are heavy and you are dead. Is a tin of German leaf worth your life, Richards? I looked at him, really looked. His spectacles were smeared with mud, the lenses scratched from the retreat, the wire bent where he'd been knocked down in the ditch near Mons. He looked old, older than the war, older than the century. He believed in order. He believed that if we followed the rules, if we kept our kits light and our minds sharp, we might survive. He thought the war was a puzzle to be solved. No, I said. No, Davies blinked, confused by the simplicity of the refusal. You won't discard it. No. It's regulation to drop non-essentials when under fire. I'm not under fire yet. You will be, he leaned in, his breath smelling of stale tea and fear. Frank, listen to me. When the shelling starts, you won't have time to think. You will react. If your pack is heavy, you will be slow. If you are slow, you will die. Give me the tin. I will bury it here. We can come back for it when the line holds. The line won't hold. How do you know? Because it never does. I patted the pocket. The metal was cold through the wool, a hard, unyielding lump against my ribs. It felt like a promise. It felt like a mistake. It felt like the only thing I owned that wasn't issued by the crown or stolen from a dead man. Bert gave it to me. He went out there to get it. He bled for it. Bert is a fool, Davies said, the words hanging in the air, harsh and sudden. Bert didn't move. He just kept smoking, the ember glowing bright in the gloom, illuminating the cut on his cheek. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He just exhaled a long stream of smoke that drifted up towards the sky, joining the mist and the smell of wet clay. Maybe, Bert said softly, but the tobacco's good. Davies stared at us, his mouth opening then closing. He saw the futility of it. He saw that we were not soldiers following regulations anymore. We were men hoarding scraps of warmth against the coming cold. He shook his head, a small, defeated gesture, and turned away. He walked to the other end of the bay, leaning his rifle against the wall, and began to check the mechanism, his fingers moving automatically over the bolt and the magazine. The light was failing. The grey of the afternoon was deepening into the bruised purple of dusk, the time when the world held its breath before the night shift began. Shadows lengthened in the trench, stretching out like fingers reaching for our ankles. The air grew colder, the dampness seeping through the soles of our boots, turning our socks into wet rags. I watched Bert. He was humming again. A different tune this time, something about a train leaving Cardiff Central, about a mother waiting on the platform with a basket of pies. He hummed it quietly, off-key, his head lolling back against the earth wall. His eyes were closed. He looked peaceful. "I'll go see her," he murmured, barely audible. "When this is done, take the train up to the valley, put some flowers on the stone. She liked lilies, said they smelled like Sunday." I said, "Lilies." "You'll come too, Frank. We'll go together, buy a bottle of whiskey in the village, drink it at the graveside, toast the old girl." "We will." He smiled, a real smile this time, cracking the grime on his face, making him look like the boy he had been before the uniforms and the mud. "Good, that's a pact then, no backing out." No backing out. The wind picked up, whistling through the barbed wire, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It carried the smell of wood smoke from the villages behind us, mixed with the rot of the no-man's land ahead. A bird cried out, a single sharp note that was swallowed instantly by the vastness of the sky. Then the ground jumped. It wasn't a sound first. It was a physical blow, a hammer strike from below that knocked the breath out of my lungs and sent a shower of loose earth raining down from the parapet. The duckboards bucked under my feet. Bert's cigarette flew from his lips, spinning into the mud. Before I could draw breath to shout, the world exploded. A roar, immense and tearing, ripped the sky apart, a cacophony of shrieking metal that drowned out thought, drowned out prayer, drowned out the very idea of silence. The trench walls shuddered, vibrating like a plucked string, and a curtain of dirt and debris collapsed over us, blinding, choking, suffocating. The air filled with the stench of high explosive, acrid and burning, stripping the oxygen from our lungs. I grabbed for Bert, my hand finding only empty air where he had been sitting a second before. The darkness was absolute, pressed down by the weight of the falling earth, and in the chaos of the shaking ground and the screaming shellfire, the pact about the lilies and the train was buried under tons of Flanders clay. The wire snagged my tunic, a sharp, tearing sound, cotton giving way to the rusted teeth of the German defense. I froze, one knee sunk in the slime, listening for the crack of a rifle that would turn my head into mist. Nothing, only the wet suck of the mud as Davies dragged his boot free behind me, a sound like a man pulling his foot from a dead horse's belly. We were out, past our own parapet. Into the grey soup they called no man's land, though there was no land to speak of, only a churned graveyard of stumps and shell holes that swallowed light and hope in equal measure. "Keep low," Davies whispered, his voice so thin it might have broken in the damp air. "Follow the cut." There was no cut. That was the first lie we told ourselves to keep moving. I had seen the gap in the wire 2 days prior through the periscope, a jagged mouth torn by our own shelling that never quite cleared the posts. It remained, a tangled beard of metal that waited for fools. Now crawling on elbows that screamed with cold, I saw it clearly. The gap was a trick. The wire here was thick, layered like a thatched roof, and behind it the shadows moved. "Bert," I hissed, reaching back. My hand found the rough wool of his sleeve. "Stop." He didn't stop. He pushed forward, eager, driven by the simple, stupid need to finish the job and get back to the warmth of the dugout where the rum ration waited. He thought he could slip through. He thought the war would make an exception for a man who joked about his mother's pies. "It's clear, Frank," he breathed, the words puffing white in front of his face. "Just a bit of a squeeze." He shoved his shoulder into the tangle. The metal groaned, a low, protesting squeal that sounded too much like a human voice in the stillness. Then the sky tore open. It wasn't a sound at first. It was light. A magnesium flare drifted down on its tiny parachute, hanging suspended above us, turning the mud into a blinding sheet of silver, turning the stumps into black skeletons, turning us into targets painted in high definition for every gun in the sector. The beauty of it was sickening. A cold, white sun born solely to kill us. "Down," Davies shouted, throwing himself flat, his face pressing into the slime. The machine gun opened up. Not a burst, but a stream, a continuous river of lead that chewed the earth around us, throwing up geysers of dirt that rained down on my neck, gritty and hot. I pressed my face into the mud, tasting iron and rot, waiting for the bullet that would punch through my spine. The noise was absolute, a physical weight that pinned me to the ground, louder than thought, louder than fear. Then the firing stopped, just like that. The sudden absence of noise was more terrifying than the roar. "Bert," I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast, waiting dark. No answer, only the hiss of the flare burning out, dripping molten metal onto the wire below. I rolled over. The mud was slick, slippery with something that wasn't water. Bert was 3 yards away, tangled in the wire he had tried to conquer. He lay on his side, one arm stretched out as if reaching for a hand that wasn't there. His chest was a ruin of red and black, the tunic shredded, the white wool of his undershirt soaked through. "Bert Evans," I said, crawling towards him, my hands sinking deep into the slurry. "Get up, we have to move." He didn't move. His eyes were open, staring at the smoke trails fading into the clouds, unseeing. The joke about the pies died in his throat, unfinished, leaving a silence that rang louder than the guns. I grabbed his collar, the rough fabric tearing under my grip, and hauled. He was dead weight, heavier than a sack of grain, heavier than the full pack I had carried from Mons, heavier than the sum of every mile we had marched. The mud fought me, clutching at his boots, refusing to let him go, as if the ground itself wanted to keep him. "Help me," I snapped at Davies, though I knew it was futile. Davies was already moving, scrambling through the muck, his spectacles lost somewhere in the dark, squinting against the gloom. He grabbed Bert's legs. Together we dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, leaving a furrow in the mud that would be filled by rain before morning. My shoulders burned, the muscles screaming, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. To stop was to admit he was gone, and I wasn't ready to admit that yet, not while his blood was still warm on my hands. We reached the trench wall. The ladder was slippery, the rungs coated in clay. We hauled him up, his body flopping like a landed fish, and dumped him onto the duckboards. He landed with a heavy thud that echoed in the narrow space, a final, brutal period at the end of his sentence. Someone handed me a canteen. I didn't ask who. I uncorked it, the smell of stale water rising to meet me, and poured a little over Bert's face. The water ran red, washing away the grime, revealing the pale skin beneath. The boy he had been before the uniform swallowed him whole. He looked peaceful now, the tension gone from his jaw, the constant movement stilled. "Bert Evans," I said again, louder this time, for the benefit of the men gathering in the shadows, the men who watched with wide, hollow eyes. "Of Blaina, son of Martha." Davies knelt beside me, his hands trembling as he reached for Bert's tunic pocket. "The letters, Frank, we should take the letters." "Leave them," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the shake that wanted to tear through my chest. "Let him take them with him, or let the mud have them. It doesn't matter now." I reached into Bert's other pocket, the one near his hip. My fingers closed around cold metal, the identity disc, and the tobacco tin, the one he had hoarded, the one he had traded rations for. I pulled them out, the chain snapping with a sharp ping that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet trench. I stuffed them into my own tunic pocket, shoving them deep until they sat hard against my thigh, a jagged, unyielding lump. The metal was cold, biting into my skin, a permanent reminder of the weight I now carried, a weight that had nothing to do with canvas straps or issued rations. It was the weight of a promise broken, of a train that would never leave Cardiff Central, of a mother who would wait on a platform for a son who was already part of the Flanders clay. Davies looked at me, his face grey in the dim light of the lantern. "What do we tell them, Frank, in the report?" I stood up, my knees cracking, the mud sucking at my boots, holding on tight. I looked down at Bert, at the stillness of him, at the terrible, absolute silence that had taken the place of his humming. "Tell them he died doing his duty," I said, turning away, feeling the tin bite deeper into my leg with every step. "Tell them nothing else matters." The lantern flame guttered, fighting the draft that swept along the parapet, casting long, dancing shadows that made the dead man's face seem to shift in the gloom. Davies waited for me to move, to step aside so he could begin the grim arithmetic of the inventory, but my boots felt rooted to the duckboards, nailed there by the cold weight against my thigh. The tin was sharp-edged, digging into the muscle, a physical anchor dragging me down while the rest of the battalion churned around us, shouting for water, for bandages, for the chaplain who wouldn't come until morning. "Frank," Davies pressed, his voice thin, stripped of its usual bookish calm. "The officer will want the kit accounted for before dawn. Regulations." "Regulations," I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Yes, let him count the buttons on a corpse if it keeps him warm." I turned my back on them, on the huddled forms of the section trying to make themselves small against the trench wall, and squeezed into the narrow recess we called a dugout. It was no more than a hole scraped into the clay, barely deep enough to sit in without your knees hitting your chin, smelling of wet earth and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. I dropped onto the damp floor, the impact jarring my spine, and pulled my legs up, curling around the space where the pack should have been. But the pack was gone, discarded somewhere in the wire during the scramble back, and yet I felt heavier now than I had at Mons, heavier than I had ever felt in my life. My hands shook, not from the cold, though the frost was already beginning to creep into the seams of my tunic, but from a sudden, violent emptiness in my gut that had nothing to do with hunger. I reached into my pocket again, needing to feel the metal, needing to prove it was real and not some trick of the exhaustion. The tin came out with a clatter against my knee, round, dented, covered in the grey slime of no man's land. Bert's tin. The one he'd polished with brick dust every Sunday until it shone like a sovereign, the one he'd sworn held the last of his mother's special mixture, a blend so strong it could strip the paint off a rifle butt. I pried the lid open, the hinge groaned, stiff with mud. Inside there was no tobacco, no dark, sweet-smelling leaf that could ease the cough or calm the nerves. Just a single small square of chocolate wrapped in silver foil that had tarnished to black. I stared at it. The memory hit me with the force of a shovel blow to the head. 2 hours ago, just before we climbed out. Bert pressing this into my palm, his grin wide and white in the darkness, claiming he'd eaten his fill of bully beef and couldn't stomach a sweet thing. A lie. He'd saved it. Saved it for a treat he knew he wouldn't live to enjoy, handing it over like a passing of the torch, or perhaps just a final joke on a friend too stupid to see the end coming. "You bloody fool," I whispered to the darkness, my throat tight. "You stubborn, stupid fool." I picked up the chocolate. It was cold, hard as a stone. I peeled back the foil, the sound loud in the small space, and popped the square into my mouth. It didn't melt. It sat on my tongue, bitter and waxy, refusing to give up any sweetness, just a hard, unyielding lump that tasted of cocoa and loss. I chewed anyway, grinding it down, forcing myself to swallow the evidence of his kindness, feeling it scrape its way down my throat like broken glass. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the sandbags, carrying the moans of the wounded who lay too far out to reach. Somewhere a man was calling for his mother, a high, thin sound that cut through the night better than any whistle. I closed my eyes, but the image of Bert's chest, the ruin of red and black, burned behind my lids. I saw the way his arm had reached out, grasping at nothing, and the way the mud had held him fast, unwilling to let go even in death. A scrap of paper lay on my knee, pulled from my notebook earlier, intended for the report. Blank, save for a few smudges of grease. I fumbled for my pencil, the wood cold and slick in my fingers. The lead was blunt. I rubbed it against the sole of my boot to sharpen it, the graphite dust mixing with the mud on the leather. "Mrs. Evans," I wrote. The handwriting was jagged, unfamiliar, the letters sprawling across the page as if my hand no longer belonged to me. Bert died quickly. I stopped. The pencil hovered over the paper, a dark speck trembling above the white. A lie. It had not been quick. It had been loud and violent and filled with the terror of the flare and the tearing of the wire. It had been slow enough for him to know he was dying, slow enough for the joke to die in his throat. He was brave, I added. Another lie. Bravery implied a choice, a conscious decision to face fear. Bert had just been there, doing what he was told, laughing until the laughing stopped. There was no glory in the way he had twisted in the mud, no honor in the way his boots had left furrows in the sludge as we dragged him back. Crumpled the paper. The sound was sharp, final. I tossed it into the corner, where it joined a pile of other discarded attempts, other failed efforts to make sense of the senseless. Sarah would want the truth, or at least a version of it that didn't smell of cordite and despair. But what truth could I give her? That her son was now part of the landscape, a feature of the terrain like the stumps and the wire, that his laugh was silenced by a machine gun burst while he tried to save a man he barely knew. No, she would get the lie. She would get the clean, neat version that the War Office preferred, the one where men fell heroically and without pain. It was the only gift I had left to give. I shoved the pencil back into my pocket and leaned my head against the cold clay wall of the dugout. The tin sat heavy in my other pocket, a constant, nagging presence. I could feel the edge of the identity disc through the fabric, pressing into my hip bone. A reminder, a debt. Davies poked his head into the opening, his face pale and drawn in the lantern light filtering from the trench. "Frank, the sergeant is asking for you. He wants to know about the wire. Says the cutting party missed a section." "I know," I said. My voice sounded distant, detached, as if it belonged to someone else. "I saw it before we went over." "You saw it?" Davies's eyes widened behind his smeared lenses. "And you didn't say?" "Didn't matter," I said, the words tasting bitter, matching the chocolate. "Nothing matters now, not the wire, not the report, not the bloody regulations." Davies flinched, recoiling slightly as if I'd struck him. He opened his mouth to argue, to quote the rulebook, to remind me of duty and order, but then he looked at the crumpled ball of paper on the floor, at the empty chocolate wrapper in my hand, and he closed his mouth again. He understood, or at least, he understood enough to know that arguing would change nothing. "The sergeant is waiting," he said softly. "Let him wait," I replied, closing my eyes again, letting the darkness take me. "I'm not going anywhere, not yet." Davies lingered for a moment, the silence stretching between us, thick and uncomfortable, before he pulled his head back out, leaving me alone with the dead man's tin and the ghost of a joke that would never be told. I sat there, listening to the wind, feeling the metal bite into my leg, wondering how long I could carry this weight before it dragged me down into the mud alongside Bert. The night stretched on, endless and cold, and the silence of the trench was louder than any shell. The collar slipped through my fingers. Wet wool, slick with rain and blood, offered no purchase. I grabbed again, higher this time, bunching the fabric near his neck until my knuckles scraped the stubble on his chin. Bert's head lolled back, mouth slack, the joke about the pies still hanging in the air between us, though the breath to speak it had gone. "Help me," I said. Davies was crouching beside us, hands hovering over the ruin of Bert's chest, as if he could stitch the hole closed with prayer. He looked at me, lenses cracked, face grey in the flare's dying light. "He's gone, Frank." "Pearl." I dug my heels into the slime. The earth sucked at my boots, greedy and cold, refusing to release its hold on me while I tried to drag another man through it. Bert weighed nothing in life, all bone and chatter, but death added stone to the muscle. He anchored himself to the Flanders soil, heavier than the pack I'd carried from Mons, heavier than the kit stuffed with rations and reserve ammunition that had blistered my shoulders for weeks. This was not weight distributed by straps. This was dead mass, dragging at my arms, pulling me down towards him. Wire snagged his tunic. A sharp tear echoed, cloth ripping like a flag in a gale. I stopped, chest heaving, the taste of copper and mud thick on my tongue. The flare sputtered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stumps look like men standing waiting. "Leave the wire," Davies whispered. He grabbed Bert's legs. "Just pull." We moved inches, then feet. The mud made a sucking sound, schlock schlock, each time we shifted him, a wet noise that reminded me of a boot pulled from a riverbank. Bert's boots left furrows, heels plowing a shallow grave behind him as we went. I kept my eyes on the trench parapet, a dark ridge 10 yards away that might as well have been miles. My shoulders burned. The straps of my own pack bit into my flesh, a familiar pain overshadowed by the strain in my lower back. "Why didn't you cut it?" Davies asked, his voice strained, breath coming in short white puffs. "Didn't see it," I lied. The wire had been there, plain as day, a glint in the moonlight before the flare popped. I had seen it. I had said nothing. The guilt sat in my gut, cold and hard as a swallowed coin. A bullet snapped overhead, close enough to sting the air. We dropped flat, pressing Bert into the sludge. I lay beside him, cheek against his cold tunic, smelling the stale tobacco that still clung to the fabric despite the blood. He smelled like the dugout, like the damp earth of Blaina, like home, not like this place. This place smelled of cordite and rotting turnips. "Move," I said. "We can't," Davies hissed. "They have the range." "They have the range whether we lie here or move. Get up." I grabbed the collar again, yanked. The fabric stretched, threatening to give way. I shifted my grip to his belt, leather stiff with dried mud, and hauled. Davies lifted the legs. We staggered forward, a three-legged beast stumbling through the dark. My boots slipped. I went down to one knee, splashing into a shell crater filled with murky water. The cold soaked through the trousers instantly, biting into the bone. I didn't feel it. I only felt the dead weight in my hands. The parapet loomed. A ladder leaned against the clay, rungs slick. "Up," I said. Davies went first, shoving Bert's legs ahead of him. I lifted from below, heaving the body upward until Davies could grip the tunic and haul. I climbed after, boots scraping the wood, hands raw. When I crested the top, the trench floor was crowded with men seeking cover, backs pressed against the sandbags. They moved aside without speaking, making space for the dead. We laid him down. Not on the mud. I found a spare sandbag, empty and dry, and shoved it under his head. I brushed the sludge from his face with my thumb, wiping away the grey grit until his skin showed pale beneath. He looked young like this, the lines of worry gone, the mouth closed. Davies stood over us, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Bert, then at me. "I'll fetch the sergeant," he said. "No," I said, "not yet." Davies hesitated. He wanted to argue, to insist on protocol, on the reporting, on the paperwork that would soon stain with rain and tea. He saw my face and changed his mind. He turned away, stepping over a coil of telephone wire to vanish into the shadow of the communication trench. I was alone with him. The trench settled around us. Men whispered in the corners, lighting cigarettes with cupped hands, the flare of matches brief and yellow. Somewhere a man vomited over the parapet, the sound rhythmic and wet. I ignored them. I reached into Bert's tunic pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of his identity disc, the string damp and frayed. I pulled it free. The chain snapped with a quiet ping. Then the tobacco tin. It was dented, the lid loose, stained with the mud of no man's land. I pried it from his pocket. It felt warm, as if his body heat still lingered in the metal, though I knew that was impossible. The cold had taken him hours ago, maybe minutes. Time didn't move right here. I held the tin in my palm. It was light, empty likely. He'd smoked the last of it before we went over, sharing the smoke with me in the dark. I closed my fingers around it. The edges dug into my skin, sharp and real. I shoved them both into my own tunic pocket. The disc clinked against the chocolate wrapper I'd saved, a dull metal sound against paper. The tin sat heavy against my thigh, a jagged lump that would bruise the skin with every step I took. I pressed my hand over the pocket, holding it there, feeling the weight settle into my hip. It was not enough, it would never be enough, but it was what I had. I looked down at Bert. His eyes were open now, staring at the trench walls, seeing nothing. I reached out and closed them. The lids were cool, stiffening already. I left my hand there for a moment, resting on his forehead, a benediction from a God who wasn't listening. "Sleep well, Bert," I said. My voice was rough, barely a whisper. He didn't answer. The silence rushed in to fill the space where his laughter used to be, thick and suffocating. I stood up. My knees cracked. The mud on my trousers was drying hard, cracking like old pottery. I needed to move. The sergeant would come soon. The report would need writing. The lies would need telling. I turned away from the body, the metal in my pocket biting into my leg with every step, a constant, jagged reminder of the cost of the night. The trench stretched out before me, dark and narrow, filled with men waiting for the next order, the next shell, the next name to be crossed off the list. I walked towards the dugout, carrying the weight, feeling heavier than I ever had under the full pack, dragged down by the invisible mass of the missing. Water squelched inside the leather. Each step sucked at the sole, a wet kissing sound that never stopped, marking the progress of a man drowning on dry land. I reached the dugout entrance and paused, hand gripping the rough timber frame to steady myself. The wood was slick, coated in a film of grease and clay that slid under my palm. Inside, the air hung heavy, thick with the smell of wet wool and something sweeter, cloying, like meat left out in the sun too long. A candle guttered on a ration box, casting long, jumping shadows against the clay walls. Major Llewellyn sat on an overturned bucket, sleeves rolled to the elbow, arms red to the shoulder. He was working on a man from the platoon, a lad named Jenkins, whose legs were stretched out on a stretcher draped with a blood-stained sheet. The saw rested on the ground beside him, teeth clogged with white bone dust. "Past the ligature," Llewellyn said. He didn't look up. His voice was flat, tired. The orderly handed him a strip of gauze, no anesthetic left. The bottle had run dry 3 days ago, smashed when a high explosive landed on the aid post near Hooge. Jenkins bit down on a strip of leather, eyes wide and fixed on the roof of the dugout, watching the water drip from the beams onto his face. He didn't blink. The water ran into his ears, down his neck, mixing with the sweat. I moved deeper into the shelter, finding a spot near the entrance where the air was less fouled. Davies was there, huddled in his greatcoat, knees drawn up to his chest. He held a tin mug in both hands, steam rising from it in thin, fragile wisps. "Tea?" Davies asked. "No." "Good, there isn't much." He took a sip, winced as the heat hit his lips. "Cold got into my toes yesterday, can't feel the ground now." "Rubs them." "Rubbing makes it worse. Llewellyn says keep them dry." Davies laughed, a short, dry sound that cracked in the middle. "Dry in this." He gestured with the mug towards the trench floor outside. The water had risen overnight, lapping at the bottom of the sandbags. It was grey and oily, reflecting the flare of a distant starshell that burst over the parapet, bathing the dugout in sudden, ghostly white light before plunging us back into the candle's dim yellow glow. I sat down, eagrav against the clay wall, and pulled my boots off. The leather peeled away with a wet tear. My socks were grey, swollen with moisture, clinging to the skin like a second layer of flesh. I peeled them down. The feet beneath were white, bloated, the skin wrinkled and soft as paper soaked in a bath. I pressed a thumb into the ankle. The indentation remained, a pale pit that refused to fill. "Bad?" Davies asked. "Getting there." "Jenkins won't walk again." "No." I wrapped the wet socks around my hands to keep them warm and reached for my haversack. The bully beef tin was cold, the fat around the edges turned white and solid. I used my bayonet to pry a chunk loose. The meat smelled of salt and iron. I chewed it slowly, swallowing without tasting. Beside me, the saw started again. The sound was rhythmic, a scraping noise that set my own teeth on edge. Jenkins made a noise in his throat, a low moan that was swallowed by the drip of water from the roof. Llewellyn worked faster. He knew the shelling would start at dawn. He needed the leg off before the ground shook too much to hold a steady hand. "Turn that light down," Llewellyn snapped. "Draw the fire." The orderly shielded the candle with his hand. The shadows lengthened, dancing over Jenkins' face. The lad's eyes were still open, staring at the beam above him. I looked away, focusing on the meat in my hand. Eating was a duty, fuel for the march. If I stopped, the cold would take me quicker. "Did the post come?" Davies asked. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "No. 4 days now. Roads cut near Zillebeck. Wagons can't get through." "My sister writes every week." Davies stared at the floor. "She sends cuttings from the paper, pictures of the boys who went out in 14. She circles the ones she knows." "Don't read them. She says they look happy." "They're dead, Davies." "I know." He took another sip of tea. "She says it keeps the neighbors talking, gives them something else to think about besides the lists." I shoved the rest of the beef into my mouth. The salt strung my tongue. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the barbed wire, a high, thin note that sounded like a woman crying. I ignored it. The wind meant nothing. The cold meant nothing. Only the feet mattered. If they went black, the knife would come for me too. I rubbed my toes, trying to summon feeling, trying to coax the blood back into the numb flesh. It was like rubbing stone. Llewellyn finished. He dropped the saw into a bucket of water with a clatter. The sound echoed in the small space, sharp and final. The orderly began to wrap the stump, winding the gauze tight around the end of the bone. Jenkins had passed out, head lolled to the side, leather strap hanging from his mouth. "Clean him up," Llewellyn said. He stood, wiping his hands on a rag that was already dark. "Get him to the dressing station if the road holds." "It won't hold," Davies said. "Mud's too deep." "Try." Llewellyn looked at us, eyes sunken in a face grey with exhaustion. "Any letters?" "None," I said. "Strange." Llewellyn lit a cigarette, the flare illuminating the deep lines around his mouth. usually come with the rations. Something's holding them up. Or someone. Maybe, he exhaled smoke into the damp air. Write home, Richards, if you haven't. Nothing to say. Tell them you're alive, that's enough. He moved past me, stepping over the stretcher to exit the dugout. The cold rushed in where he had been, biting at my exposed ankles. I pulled my boots back on. They were tighter now, the leather stiffened by the drying mud. I laced them up, pulling the knots tight. Davies watched me. You keeping Bert's tin? Yes. Good, he looked down at his own feet. Someone should keep the things, otherwise they just get lost in the mud. I'll keep them. Davies. Yes. If I go, send my book home. You'll send it. Just say you will. I will. He nodded, satisfied, and leaned his head back against the clay. The candle flickered, threatening to die. I reached into my tunic pocket and touched the metal of Bert's disc. It was cold against my fingers. I thought of Aunt Sarah in Blaina. She would be waiting by the door, checking the postman's bag, wondering why the silence stretched so long. She would be lighting the fire in the parlor, putting the kettle on for a visitor who wouldn't arrive. The disconnect was a physical pain, sharper than the cold in my feet. Here, we sawed off legs over the ration tin. There, she arranged Christmas decorations on a mantelpiece. Two worlds, separated by a strip of water and a bag of mail that never came. I picked up my pencil. The tip was broken. I sharpened it with my knife, the wood shaving curling onto my knee. I needed to write, not because it would help, but because Llewellyn was right. The silence was too heavy to carry alone. The ground shook, a distant thud deep underground, then another. The shelling was starting early. Davies opened his eyes. That's close. Get your helmet, I said. He moved slowly, stiffly. I stood up, feeling the weight of the pack, the weight of the tin, the weight of the promise. The candle went out. We were left in the dark, listening to the earth break open above us. The smell of beeswax hung heavy in the parlor, fighting a losing battle against the coal smoke that seeped through the sash windows regardless of how tightly the draft excluders were stuffed. Sarah dipped the nib into the inkwell. The black liquid stood still, cold enough to slow the flow. She pressed the pen to the paper. The line wavered. A small tremor started in her wrist, traveling up to the elbow, a vibration that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do the empty space on the hall table where the postman's knock should have landed 10 mornings ago. Still at it then. Mrs. Gwynn stood in the doorway, wiping her feet on the coir mat. She held a basket covered with a checked cloth. Steam rose from the edge where the fabric had slipped. Just finishing, Sarah said. She did not look up. She focused on the loop of the Y in Dearest Frank. If she looked at Mrs. Gwynn, she might see the pity there, and pity was a luxury she could not afford to house today. Mrs. Evans sent a tart, says you need keeping up. Mrs. Gwynn moved into the room, placing the basket on the sideboard. She glanced at the papers spread near the inkwell. Any news? No. 10 days is a long stretch. The roads are cut. Llewellyn wrote to his mother same thing. Zillebek is mud. Sarah dipped the pen again. The nib scratched, catching on the fiber of the page. She pressed harder. The ink blotched, a dark eye staring back at her. I'm telling him about the holly, that's enough. Holly doesn't fill a belly. Mrs. Gwynn pulled out a chair and sat. The wood groaned under her weight. She picked up a sheet of paper from the stack, the one with the official crest at the top. What's this? Nothing. Sarah reached for it, but Mrs. Gwynn held it firm. Next of kin form, for the Prosser boy. Mrs. Gwynn's voice dropped, losing its Market Square edge. They sent it to you because his mother can't read the print. I know what it is. You're filling it out. Someone has to. Sarah pulled the paper back. The creases sounded loud in the quiet room. She smoothed it flat with her palm. The official typeface was crisp, unforgiving. Confirm relationship, confirm address, confirm receipt of effects. The words were clean. They did not smell of mud or gangrene. They did not mention the sawing noise that woke her in the night, though she had never heard a saw in her life. It's just paperwork, Gwyn. Don't make it into a sermon. It's a precursor. It's a form. Sarah turned back to her letter. She needed to write about the decorations. Frank liked the traditions. He liked knowing the house stood steady while he was out there in the wet. She wrote, "The parlor looks very nice," and stopped. The lie sat on the page naked. The parlor looked like a waiting room. The holly berries were drying out, turning black and shriveled like old wounds. She dipped the pen. The tremor returned, stronger this time. She gripped the wood until her knuckles whitened, forcing the hand to obey. "Did you hear about the Davies boy?" Mrs. Gwynn asked. She leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Corporal from the valley." "There are many Davies." "Bookish one, spectacles." Sarah's pen stopped. The ink pooled at the tip of the nib, swelling into a dark drop that threatened to fall. She held her breath. If the drop fell, it would ruin the line. It would ruin the cheerfulness. She lifted the pen slowly, catching the drop on the edge of the inkwell before it could stain the promise she was writing. "I haven't heard," she said. Her voice was flat. She kept her eyes on the paper. "Frank would tell me." "Would he?" Mrs. Gwynn stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the street where the gas lamps were being lit early against the afternoon gloom. "They don't tell us everything, Sarah. They censor the bad bits. You know that." "He tells me what matters." "He tells you what he thinks you can bear." Mrs. Gwynn turned back. Her face was soft, tired. "Fill the form for Prosser, but don't fill it for Frank yet, not until you have the box." "There is no box." "Not yet." Sarah capped the pen. The click sounded like a lock engaging. She picked up the letter and folded it, 3 folds, precise. She matched the edges carefully, ensuring the corners aligned perfectly. If the edges were straight, the news inside might be straight too. She slid the paper into the envelope. The paper slid smoothly, making a whispering sound as it entered the dark. She licked the flap. The glue tasted of starch and salt. She pressed it down. "Take the tart," Mrs. Gwynn said. She moved towards the door, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. "And burn that form if it isn't for your own. It's for Prosser. Keep it away from Frank's letter." Mrs. Gwynn left. The door closed with a solid thud that shook the frame. Sarah stood alone in the parlor. The clock on the mantel ticked, a mechanical rhythm that measured seconds she could not get back. She picked up the envelope. It felt light, too light to carry the weight of what she hadn't written. She hadn't told him about the tremor. She hadn't told him about the form. She had written about the holly and the tart and the weather, which was rain, always rain. She pulled on her coat. The wool was heavy, smelling of camphor and old smoke. She stepped out into the hallway and took the envelope from the table. The paper was cool against her palm. She walked to the front door and opened it. The air outside was sharp, biting at her exposed cheeks. The street was empty, no postman, no delivery boy, just the wet pavement reflecting the yellow gaslight. She walked to the post box on the corner. The iron was cold, painted red, but chipped to reveal the gray metal beneath. She lifted the flap. It resisted, stiff with cold, then swung open with a metallic creak. The interior was dark, a void. She dropped the letter inside. It fell silently, joining the hundreds of other pleas and lies and love notes swirling in the dark bag below. She let the flap close. The latch clicked. Sarah stood there for a moment, hand resting on the cold iron. She waited for a feeling, relief perhaps, or dread. There was nothing, just the cold seeping through her glove. She turned back towards the house. The windows glowed warm yellow against the blue dusk. Inside, the fire was dying. The tea was getting cold. She walked back up the path, her footsteps crisp on the frost-hardened mud of the garden. Inside, she picked up the Prosser form again. She looked at the line for relationship to deceased. She dipped the pen. The ink flowed freely now, warm from the room. She wrote neighbor. She did not write son. She did not write friend. She blew on the ink to dry it. The wet shine disappeared, leaving the word matte and final. She stacked the form under the inkwell, out of sight. The clock struck 6. The sound resonated in the wood of the case. Somewhere miles away, Frank would be waking up, or sleeping, or dying. The letter was in the bag. The bag was on a train. The train was moving east. She poured the tea. It was lukewarm. She drank it anyway. The warmth spread through her chest, fleeting. She sat in the chair by the fire and watched the flames die down to embers. The room grew darker. She did not light the lamp. She sat in the grey half-light, listening to the wind rattle the pane, waiting for a knock that would not come tonight. The silence in the room was absolute. It pressed against her ears. She closed her eyes and saw the red box on the corner. The letter was gone. It was out of her hands now. It belonged to the army, to the post, to the mud. She opened her eyes. The fire sparked, a small orange flare in the grate. She reached for the poker and stirred the coals. Ash rose in a grey cloud, settling on the hearth. She needed to write another one tomorrow. She needed to keep the line open. If she stopped writing, the silence might win. She stood up and walked to the window. The street was empty. The gas lamp flickered in the wind. A shadow moved at the end of the road. A figure, walking slowly. She leaned closer, pressing her hand against the cold glass. The figure stopped, looked up, then turned down the side street, not the postman, just a man going home. She stepped back from the window. The glass retained the heat of her palm for a second, then cooled. She turned away from the window and went to the table. She picked up the pen again. There was more to say. There was always more to say. The paper waited, white, blank, hungry. She began to write, "My dear Frank, I hope this finds you well." The words flowed easier this time. The tremor was gone, for now she wrote about the coal strike. She wrote about the price of bread. She wrote about nothing. She wrote until the ink ran low. She did not stop. To stop was to think was to fear. She kept the pen moving. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the house. It was a small sound, a fragile sound, but it was hers. Outside, the wind picked up. It whistled through the cracks in the frame. Sarah did not hear it. She was watching the ink dry. The water rose to my ankles before breakfast, cold enough to stop the breath in the throat. It was not rain anymore. It was the sky falling down and refusing to drain away. The trench had become a canal of grey slurry, sucking at the legs with a greedy, wet mouth that wanted to pull a man down into the deep. I stood on the duckboards, feeling the wood shift under the weight of the water, each step a squelch that sounded like a boot pulling free from a corpse. My toes were gone. Not missing, just absent, replaced by a numbness that climbed up the shins like a slow fire made of ice. I looked down at my feet. They were swollen, the leather of the boots tight against the skin, white and bloated like fish left too long on the slab. "Move your feet, Richards," the medical officer said. He did not look up from the table he had set up on the firing step. "Keep them moving, or they'll take the lot." He was cutting a man's leg off 3 yards from where Evans used to joke about his mother's pastry. The smell was thick, a mix of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the sweet, coppery tang of blood that never quite washed away. The saw bit into the bone with a sound like teeth grinding on stone, a harsh, rhythmic scraping that drowned out the distant thump of the German guns. The man on the table did not scream. He just stared at the sandbags above his head, his eyes wide and fixed on a spot of sky that was not there. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden plank until the knuckles turned the color of old parchment. "Pass the chloroform," the MO said. His voice was flat, stripped of any pity. "And get that bucket out of the way." I kicked the bucket. It skidded across the wet floorboards, spilling a mixture of bloody water and sawdust. The liquid splashed against my puttees, soaking the fabric instantly. I did not wipe it off. There was no point. Everything was wet. Everything was rotting. I watched the MO lift the leg. It came away with a wet tear, the flesh separating from the bone like overcooked meat. He dropped it into a sack that was already heavy with other pieces of men. The sack thudded against the floor. A dull, final sound. "Next," the MO said. There was no next. Davies was sitting in the corner, huddled against the earth wall. He was holding his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. His spectacles lay on the ground beside him, one lens shattered, the frame twisted into a useless circle of wire. A piece of shrapnel had come through the parapet an hour ago, singing a high, thin note before it struck the glass. Now Davies was blind. He squinted at the world, trying to force it into focus, but his eyes were useless without the lenses. He looked like a child lost in a crowd, small and broken. "Davies," I said. My voice sounded rough, scraped raw by the smoke. "Get up." He did not move. "I can't see, Frank. I can't see the step. I can't see the rifle." "You don't need to see the rifle. You need to stay off the fire step." I walked over to him. The water sucked at my boots, making a noise like a kiss. I grabbed his shoulder. The fabric of his tunic was soaked, heavy with the weight of the trench. "Come on, up." He stumbled as he stood, his hands flailing for purchase. He caught my arm, his fingers digging into the sleeve. "Where are my glasses? Did you see them?" "They're gone." "Gone?" He pulled away, stumbling back into the mud. "I can't fight without them. I can't read the orders. I can't see the wire." "You'll manage." How his voice cracked, a high, thin sound that cut through the drone of the shells. How do I manage when I can't see the man next to me? How do I know if he's alive or dead? I did not answer. There was no answer that would help. I reached into my tunic pocket and pulled out the small book Davies had given me yesterday. The cover was damp, the pages swollen with moisture. I wiped it on my sleeve, trying to dry the surface, but the paper was too far gone. The ink had run, blurring the words into grey smudges. I held it out to him. "Here," I said, "you can feel the pages." He took it. His hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped it. He ran his fingers over the cover, tracing the embossed letters that he could no longer read. "Poetry," he whispered. "It's useless now. It's all just paper." "It's better than nothing." He looked at me, his eyes unfocused and wet. Is it really?" I turned away. I could not look at him. The sight of him, so helpless, so stripped of his dignity, was worse than the amputation. At least the man on the table would live. Davies was already dead. He just did not know it yet. I walked back to my position on the firing step. The water was higher now, lapping at the top of my boots. The cold had reached my knees. I could feel it in the marrow, a deep, aching chill that no amount of movement could shift. A runner arrived an hour later, slipping and sliding in the mud, his face pale beneath the grime. He carried a message tube sealed with red wax. He handed it to the sergeant, who broke the seal with a muddy thumb. The sergeant read the paper, his lips moving silently as he decoded the orders. His face did not change. It remained a mask of grey stone, unreadable and hard. "Nonni Bostjan," the sergeant said. His voice was low, barely audible over the wind. "We move at dawn." A groan went up from the line. It was not a shout, just a collective exhalation of despair, the sound of men who knew they were walking into a slaughterhouse. Davies looked up from the corner. "Where?" he asked. "I can't hear properly." "Nonni Bostjan," I said. "We attack." He stood up again, swaying slightly. "I need my boots tied," he said. "They came undone when I fell." I looked at his feet. The laces were indeed loose, trailing in the mud. I knelt down in the water. The cold bit through my trousers, sharp and immediate. I grabbed the laces. They were stiff with mud, frozen into hard knots. I worked at them with numb fingers, trying to loosen the tangle. The mud caked under my nails, gritty and foul. I pulled the ends tight, making a double knot, securing the boot to the foot. It felt like tying a noose. Like sealing a fate that had already been decided by men in warm rooms far away from the mud. "There," I said. I stood up. My knees cracked, the joints stiff with the cold. "That should hold." Davies nodded. He patted his pocket, checking for the book. "Thank you, Frank." "Don't thank me." He smiled, a faint, ghostly thing that did not reach his eyes. "We'll be all right, won't we?" I looked at him. I looked at the broken glasses, the trembling hands, the book that was already disintegrating in his pocket. I looked at the line of men waiting in the water, their faces grey and hollow, their eyes fixed on nothing. I thought of the sack of legs by the medical table. I thought of the silence that would follow the whistle. "Yes," I lied, "we'll be all right." The wind picked up, whistling through the wire, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. It was a cold wind, a wind that knew no mercy. It blew through the trench, chilling the bone, freezing the blood. Davies shivered. He pulled his greatcoat tighter around himself, trying to keep the warmth in. He could not see the wire ahead. He could not see the grave that waited. He could only feel the knot I had tied, tight against his ankle, a small anchor in a sea of mud. The sergeant checked his watch. The hands glowed faintly in the gloom. 10 minutes, he said. "Get ready." I checked my rifle. The bolt slid back with a gritty scrape. The oil had frozen. I wiped it on my sleeve again, trying to clear the mechanism. It was useless. Everything was useless. But we would go anyway. We would climb the step. We would walk into the wire, and we would die or we would live, and it would not matter in the end. The mud would take us all eventually. It was just a question of when. Davies touched my arm. "Frank." "What? If I don't make it?" "Don't say it." "If I don't," he insisted, his voice trembling, "take the book to my sister in Cardiff. She lives on Mermaid Street, number 4. "I know where she lives, Davies. Promise me." I looked at him. His face was pale, his eyes blind and trusting. He was asking me to carry a ghost, To carry a weight that would only get heavier with every mile. I nodded. I promise. He let out a breath, a long, shaky sigh. Good, that's good. The whistle blew, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the wind. It was the signal, the end of waiting, the start of the killing. Men began to move, climbing the step, their boots slipping in the mud. Davies moved with them, stepping carefully, feeling his way forward. I followed. The water sucked at my heels, trying to hold me back. I pulled free. I climbed. The world above the trench was grey and featureless, a landscape of wire and death. I stepped out into it. The ground was soft, too soft. It gave way under my feet. I kept walking. Davies was ahead of me, a dark shape in the fog. He was humming something, a tune I did not know. It was a quiet sound, lost in the roar of the guns. I listened to it. It was the last thing I heard before the world exploded. The earth jumped. It was not a sound so much as copyright Cisadilla blow that lifted me off my feet and threw me face down into the slime where 3 degrees tasted of copper and old pennies. My lungs emptied in a rush, stolen by the blast, and for a heartbeat there was nothing but the ringing in my ears and the cold mud pressing against my lips. Then the noise returned, a tearing roar that shredded the air, and I pushed myself up, hands sinking deep into the churned ground until I found something solid to lever against. Get up, move. The sergeant's voice cracked like a whip, though I barely heard the words over the concussion. I saw his mouth shape the command, saw the spit fly from his lips, but the sound arrived late, distorted by the pressure still battering my head. I scrambled to my knees. The pack dragged at my shoulders, heavy as a dead man's embrace, the straps biting into the collarbone where the skin had already rubbed raw during the retreat. Every step required a deliberate heave, a negotiation with the gravity that seemed to have doubled in the last minute. Men were falling around us, not in the orderly lines of the parade ground, but crumpling, folding into the mud as if their bones had turned to wet clay. To my left, a young lad from Swansea clutched at his throat, eyes wide and unseeing, before tipping sideways into a shell hole filled with grey water. He did not scream. There was no time for screaming. The air was thick with iron fragments, buzzing like angry hornets, snapping through the mist and finding flesh with indifferent precision. Keep going, Richards, don't stop. I lurched forward. My rifle felt clumsy in my hands, the wood slick with mud, the bolt stiff from the cold. I kept my eyes on the back of the man ahead, a dark shape stumbling through the smoke. Davies. He was 10 yards out, moving with that careful, measured gait of a man who cannot see the ground clearly. His glasses were gone, lost in the jump, and he navigated the cratered landscape by feel, tapping his boot against the earth before committing his weight. A shell landed close, 20 yards to the right. The ground rippled. Dirt rained down, heavy clods that struck my helmet with dull thuds. I flinched, instinct driving my head down, but forced my legs to keep churning. The mud sucked at my boots, each step a battle against the suction that sought to hold us fast in the Flanders soil. It was a living thing, this mud, greedy and cold, wanting to swallow the lot of us down into the dark where the roots of the trees rotted. Davies, I shouted, the word tore at my throat, keep moving. He did not turn, he could not hear me. The noise was a wall, solid and impenetrable, shutting out everything but the immediate necessity of putting one foot in front of the other. I watched him stumble over a tangle of wire, catch himself on a stake, and push on. He looked small against the vastness of the field, a solitary figure walking into the grey curtain of smoke that hid the German lines. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The air smelled of cordite and wet wool, mixed with the sharper, sweeter scent of opened bodies. I tried not to look at the men lying in the mud. I knew some of them. I knew where they were from, what they ate for breakfast, the names of their sisters. Looking would only slow me down, and stopping meant death. The pack shifted on my back, the contents rattling softly with each stride. Bert's tobacco tin knocked against my ribcage, a dull metallic reminder of the friend who was already gone, and now Davies's book pressed against my spine, heavy with words I could not read in the dark. Down. I dropped without thinking. A burst of machine gun fire stitched a line through the air where my head had been a second before, snapping the tops off the weeds and kicking up spurts of dirt. I lay flat, cheek pressed to the cold earth, listening to the bullets crack overhead. Beside me, a corporal was trying to free his foot from a tangle of barbed wire. He pulled at his leg, cursing, his face twisted in pain. Leave it, I said. Cut the lace. It's stuck, he gasped. The wires through the leather. Cut it. I drew my knife. The blade was dull, clogged with mud, but I sawed at the leather lace until it parted. He scrambled free, leaving the boot behind, and crawled forward on hands and knees, dragging his socked foot through the slime. I pushed myself up again. The weight on my shoulders felt immense, as if the pack were filled with stones instead of kit. It pulled me backward, resisting every inch of ground I gained. Davies was further ahead now. He had stopped. He was standing upright in the open, swaying slightly, looking left and right like a man who had lost his way on a country lane. He should have been down. Everyone else was down. The fire was tearing through the air, thick and relentless, yet he stood there, exposed, a dark silhouette against the pale smoke. "Davies, get down," I yelled. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the roar of the guns. He turned. I saw the pale oval of his face, the confusion in his posture. He raised a hand, not in surrender, but as if to shield his eyes from a sun that was not shining. He was listening for something, perhaps the poetry he had quoted in the trench, perhaps the voice of his sister in Cardiff. He stood there while the world tore itself apart around him, unmoving, a statue of calm in the midst of the hurricane. "Move, you fool!" The sergeant was beside me now, shoving my shoulder, driving me forward. "Don't look at him. Keep your head down." "He's stopped," I said. "Everyone stops eventually. Keep moving." I forced my legs to work. The mud released my boot with a wet slurp. I took another step, then another. The pack dragged at me, anchoring me to the earth, reminding me of everything I was carrying, everything I had promised to deliver. Davies was still standing. He was turning slowly, pivoting on his heels, searching for something in the smoke. I wanted to go back. I wanted to grab him by the collar and throw him into the mud where he would be safe. But the line was moving, a ragged flow of grey coats pushing forward against the resistance of the fire, and I was part of the flow. "Come on." I stumbled over a body. I did not look at the face. I stepped on the chest to gain leverage and pushed on. The noise was inside me now, vibrating in the bone, silencing any thought of fear or hope. There was only the next step, the next breath, the weight on the back. Davies was 10 yards away. 5, I could see the mud on his puttees, the tear in his greatcoat sleeve. He was smiling. He was actually smiling, a faint, ghostly expression that did not belong in this place. "Davies," I said. The ground beneath him shifted. It was not a direct hit. There was no fire, no flash, just a sudden displacement of air, a compression of the atmosphere that struck him with the force of a giant's hand. He did not fall. He vanished. One moment he was there, solid and real, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the earth and the smoke, leaving nothing behind but the sudden, terrible absence of him. I stopped. My feet refused to move. The pack felt heavier than it ever had on the march from Mons, heavier than lead, dragging me down into the mud where the water was rising to meet my knees. The smoke curled around my legs, thick and yellow, hiding the hole where he had been. I stood there, alone in the open, while the bullets continued to snap and the shells continued to scream, waiting for a shape to emerge from the grey that I knew would not come. The order came from somewhere inside my own head, loud enough to cut through the ringing in my ears. I threw myself forward, knees hitting the waterlogged earth, sliding into the depression where the shell had landed. The sides were steep, slick with clay that smeared across my tunic like wet cement. Someone was already there, huddled against the far wall, rifle clutched across his chest. "Room for one more?" I asked. He didn't look up, just nodded, shifting his shoulder to make space. His face was masked in grey dust, eyelashes crusted with mud. "Where did he go?" I said. "Who?" "Davies, Corporal Davies." The man spat into the mud. Gone, all of him. Pressed my back against the cold clay. The pack dug into my spine, hard edges biting through the wool. I reached around, fingers fumbling over the canvas, checking the straps. Everything was there, the tin, the book. The weight remained unchanged, though the man who lent me the book was no longer part of the equation. Outside the crater, the noise continued, a relentless tearing sound like canvas being ripped by a giant hand. Shells walked across the field, exploding in a line, marching towards the German wire. "Keep your head down," the man said. "They're ranging." I pulled my knees to my chest. My hands were shaking. I looked at them, expecting to see blood, but they were clean except for the mud. Davies had been standing there. 1 second solid, the next nothing. No body to retrieve, no tag to clip from a buttonhole. Just a hole in the ground and the air smelling of sulfur and turned earth. I reached into my tunic pocket. The paper was damp, swollen at the edges. I pulled it out. The cover of the book had lost its shape, the cloth binding peeling away from the boards like dead skin. Inside, the pages were stuck together, fused by the wet. I tried to pry them apart with a thumbnail, but the paper tore, leaving a ragged white scar on the print. "Reading material?" the man asked. He glanced at the book, then back to the rim of the hole. "Belonged to a friend. Lost him. Just now." "Sorry," he didn't sound sorry. He sounded tired. "Name?" "Davies." "Mine's Evans, not the Burt one. There's too many of us." He shifted his rifle, the wood groaning. "You can't read that anyway. Inkleby Run." I looked at the page. Black smudges bled across the text, drowning the words in grey floods. A poem about a nightingale or maybe a tree. It didn't matter now. The words were gone, just like the man who bought the book in a shop on Commercial Street before we shipped out. He had talked about giving it to his sister. Said she liked the verses. Said she needed something pretty to look at when the mines closed and the lights went out early. "I promised to send it home," I said. "Send it where?" Evans laughed, a short, dry bark. "Post won't come through this. Look at the sky." I looked. The clouds hung low, bruised purple and grey, pressing down on the field. No planes, no post wagon, just the smoke drifting across the wire, thick and oily. "He had spectacles," I said. "Wire rims, round." "Didn't see them. They were on his face." "Nothing's on anyone's face out there anymore. Keep your head down, Frank." He knew my name, I didn't know his. That was how it worked. You learned the names of the dead and forgot the living because the living might be dead by tea time. I pushed the book back into my pocket. It sat against my hip, a wet lump heavier than it should be. The pack shifted as I breathed, the straps creaking. I thought about dropping it. Regulations said to lighten the load in an assault. Drop the pack, move fast, live. I kept the pack on. A shell landed close, 50 yards out. The earth jumped. Dirt rained down into the crater, sprinkling over our helmets like gravel. Evans flinched, pulling his neck into his shoulders, but he didn't move otherwise. We sat there, 2 men in a hole, waiting for the earth to settle. The noise was inside my head now, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the explosions. It felt like a wire tightened behind my eyes, pulling tighter with every burst. "He quoted poetry," I said, "before we went over." "Did he?" Evans cleaned his fingernails with his bayonet. "What sort?" "Didn't listen." "Smart." "Said something about dusk or dawn, can't recall." "Doesn't matter." Evans snapped the bayonet back into its scabbard. "Nothing matters until the shelling stops." I closed my eyes. The image of Davies standing there smiling burned behind my lids. He looked peaceful. That was the worst part. Not the pain, not the blood, but the peace on his face while the world ended around him. He believed in order. Believed that if you kept your kit clean and your verses memorized, you could keep the chaos at bay. The shell proved him wrong. The mud proved him wrong. There was no order here, only the random arithmetic of high explosives. The firing lifted. The line of explosions moved further away, towards the village. The sudden drop in noise was more shocking than the start. My ears popped. The whine faded, leaving a hollow space where the sound had been. "They're lifting," Evans said. He peeked over the rim. "Smoke's clearing." "Where are we?" "Near the farmhouse. The one with the barn collapsed." He dropped back down. "We move in 5. Sergeant says consolidate." I stood up. My legs felt stiff, joints filled with sand. I checked the pocket again. The book was still there. I could leave it. Bury it in the mud with the rest of Davies. It would be easier. Less weight. Less memory dragging at my hip every time I marched. I buttoned the pocket. "Ready?" Evans asked. He stood, shouldering his rifle. "Ready. Leave the dead." "I know." He climbed out first, scrambling up the clay slope, rifle ready. I followed, boots slipping, hands grabbing at the roots of grass that held the earth together. At the top, the air was colder. The smoke hung low, stinging my eyes. I looked back at the crater, just a hole, no mark of where Davies stood. No blood, no bone. The farmhouse ruins lay 50 yards to the left. Brick walls stood jagged against the sky, windows gaping like empty sockets. Men were moving towards it, grey figures flowing into the shadows. I started walking. The pack rubbed my shoulders, raw skin protesting the friction. Every step felt like wading through deep water. "Richards," the sergeant waved from the doorway of the barn. "Get inside, write your letters." "Letters?" "Post might come tomorrow, if the road's clear." He turned away, wiping mud from his face. "Tell them you're well, don't tell them about Davies." I stopped. The wind picked up, blowing smoke across the yard. It smelled of burnt wood and something sweeter, something that made my stomach turn. I looked at the barn, dark and inviting. Inside there would be paper. There would be ink. I had to write to Sarah. She would want to know. She would want to know everything. I walked towards the barn. My hand stayed on my pocket, holding the book in place. It felt hot against my leg. I pushed open the door. The darkness inside smelled of old hay and horses. I found a crate near the wall and sat down. The wood creaked under my weight. I took out my pen. The ink was cold. I uncapped it. The nib gleamed in the dim light. I looked at the paper, white and clean, waiting. I put the pen down, reached into my pocket, pulled out the book. The pages were stuck fast. I ran my thumb over the cover, wet cloth, rough texture. I could not send this. I could not send any of it, but I could not throw it away. I placed the book beside my knee, opened the diary, picked up the pen. The first word was the hardest. "Dear Aunt Sarah." The ink flowed, black on white. A lie, all of it a lie. I wrote about the weather. I wrote about the rations. I did not write about the hole in the field. I did not write about the spectacles lost in the mud. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words blurred together. Outside, the shelling started again, distant, thudding against the earth. I capped the pen, closed the book, slid the diary back into the tunic, picked up Davies's book. It went into the pack, deep down, under the socks, under the tin. I tightened the straps. The weight settled on my shoulders, heavy, permanent. I stood up, walked to the door. The night was falling. The stars were hidden behind the smoke. I stepped out into the yard. The cold hit me like a blow. I buttoned my tunic to the chin. The wind blew through the gaps in the brickwork, whistling low. Someone was coming up the path, a runner, holding a stack of envelopes. "Post," he yelled, "post for the Welch." I walked towards him. My boots crunched on the frozen mud. I didn't look back at the barn. I didn't look at the field. I kept my eyes on the envelopes. One might have my name, one might have Davies's. Most would go back, unclaimed. I reached out, took the pile, felt the weight of the paper in my hands, light, too light. "Anything for me?" I asked. The runner shook his head. "Nothing for Richards, nothing for Davies." He moved on, calling names. I stood there, holding the letters for men who were still alive. The wind tugged at the paper. I tucked them into my pocket, next to the book. I turned back to the barn. The darkness waited. I walked inside, sat on the crate, took out the pen again. There was more to write, things I couldn't say in the first letter, things about the weight, about the pack, about the things we carry when the rest is gone. I dipped the pen. The ink was black, like the mud, like the smoke. I began to write. The nib scratched, a dry, rasping sound that tore at the quiet of the barn. Ink pooled on the page, a dark stain spreading into the fibers of the paper before I could drag it into a letter. My hand shook, not from the cold, though the frost had settled deep in my bones, but from the sheer effort of holding the pen steady while the world outside continued to grind itself into dust. "Dear Aunt Sarah," I had written, then nothing. The rest was a list of lies. Rations are sufficient. The weather is dry. We are in reserve. I looked at the words. They sat there, neat and orderly, like soldiers on parade before the first shell lands. A fiction, a comfortable cushion for a woman sitting by a fire in Blaina, worrying about whether her nephew had enough wool. She did not need to know that the mud out there was eating men alive, swallowing them whole, until there was nothing left to bury but a pair of broken spectacles and a book of poems soaked in grey sludge. Davies would have hated the lie. He was a man of facts, of verses that measured the world in feet and inches, in rhymes that resolved neatly at the end of a line. He believed that if you kept your kit clean and your mind sharp, you could keep the chaos at bay. He had whispered something as we went over the top. A line from Tennyson, perhaps, or maybe Hardy, something about duty, something about honor. I tried to recall it now, closed my eyes and reached back through the noise of the shelling, the scream of the high explosive, the wet thud of bodies hitting the ground. The memory slipped away. All I could hear was the roar. All I could see was the spot where he had been standing 1 second and the empty, churning mud the next. No body, no grave, just a gap in the line that no one could fill. The pen hovered, a drop of ink fell. It hit the paper and bloomed, a small black flower of truth amidst the white lies. Bert is dead, I wrote, the letters jagged, ugly, and Davies is gone. I stopped, the ink ran together, blurring the names until they looked like smudges of dirt. That was all they were now, smudges. Statistics for the War Office to tally up in a ledger somewhere in London. Killed in action, missing, wounded. 3 categories for a lifetime of laughter, of quiet reading by candlelight, of jokes about mothers' pies and sisters in Cardiff. My shoulder ached. The pack sat heavy against the crate, leaning against my leg. I could feel the weight of it even when I wasn't wearing it. It was a physical thing, that burden. Not just the canvas and the leather, the rifle and the bayonet, but the things I had stuffed inside against regulation. Bert's tobacco tin, dented and empty, rattling softly when I moved. The identity disc of a boy from Merthyr who had died 3 days ago, his name still warm on the metal. And now this, Davies's book. I reached down, unbuckled the strap. The leather groaned, stiff with dried mud. I opened the flap. Inside, the smell of stale sweat and wet wool rose up, thick and cloying. I dug past the spare socks, past the hardtack biscuit I had been saving for 2 days, until my fingers found the cloth cover. I pulled it out. It was a mess. The covers were swollen with water, the pages fused together in a solid block of pulp. I tried to pry them apart gently using the tip of the penknife. The paper tore. A fragment came away in my hand, soggy and grey. I could make out a single word, hope, or maybe home. The ink had run, the letters bleeding into each other until the meaning was lost. Davies had carried this everywhere. In India, in the barracks, in the trenches of the Aisne. He had read from it when the shelling was distant, his voice low and steady, giving us something else to think about besides the rats and the lice. He had said that words mattered, that culture was the only thing that separated us from the beasts in the fields. The beasts were winning. I looked at the fragment in my hand. It disintegrated under my thumb, turning into a small ball of grey paste. I wiped my fingers on my trousers. There was no point in trying to save it. The water had done its work. The war had done its work. The order Davies believed in, the dignity he tried to maintain, it had all been washed away in the mud of non-knee Boston. Richards! Evans stood in the doorway. His silhouette was framed by the dying light outside, the smoke drifting past him like a ghost. He held a mug in one hand, steam rising from it. Tea, he said, hot water, found a tin behind the wall. I'm writing, I said. My voice sounded rough, unused. Write faster, post goes at dawn, if the runner lives that long. He stepped inside, the mud on his boots crunching on the straw. He looked at the book in my lap. That it? Yes. Can you read it? No. He took a sip from the mug, winced as the heat hit his lips. Pity, he liked that one, the one about the soldier coming home. He's not coming home, Evans. I know, Evans looked down at the book. His face was tired, the lines around his eyes deep and dark. None of us are really, not the way we were. He set the mug down on a crate beside me. The steam curled up, mixing with the dust motes dancing in the dim light. Sergeant says we move out at first light, he said. Heading towards Ypres, proper trenches this time, or so they say. Trenches, I repeated. The word felt heavy. Another hole to dig, another place to wait for the shells. I dig in, hold the line. Evans kicked at a loose stone. Reckon we'll be there a while. I looked back at the letter. The names of the dead stared up at me. Bert, Davies, I could cross them out. Pretend I hadn't written them. Send the letter as it was, full of lies about dry weather and sufficient rations. Let Sarah think we were safe. Let her think her nephew was coming home for Christmas. But the pack waited, open, hungry. I picked up the sodden book. It felt heavier than it looked, a brick of pulp and memory. I could leave it here, burn it in the stove, let it turn to ash and join the thousands of other things the war had destroyed. It would be easier, lighter. I thought of Davies's sister in Cardiff. She was waiting for a letter, a package, something to show that her brother had existed, that he had been more than a name on a list. She would never get the book. She would never get the brother, but she might get the knowledge that someone had tried to save it, that someone had carried it when logic said to drop it. I shoved the book into the pack, pushed it down hard, beneath the tobacco tin, beneath the socks. It slid into the bottom, adding its weight to the rest. The pack sagged. The straps pulled tight against my shoulders, even though I wasn't wearing it yet. Right, I said. I capped the pen. The click sounded loud in the silence. I'm done. Good. Evans picked up his mug. Drink this before it goes cold. You look like you've seen a ghost. Just the dead, I said. Same thing. He didn't laugh. He just nodded, took another sip, and turned back to the door. Don't take too long. Dawn comes early. He left. The darkness rushed back in to fill the space he had occupied. I sat alone with the letter, the mug of tea, and the pack. The tea steamed. The letter lied. The pack held the truth. I folded the paper, slid it into an envelope, sealed it with a lick of glue that tasted of chemicals and dust. I wrote Sarah's address on the front, Mrs. S. Williams, 42 Oak Street, Blaina. Then I added a postscript, small, in the corner. The pack is heavy, Aunt Sarah, but I am carrying it. I placed the envelope on top of the pack. Tomorrow, the runner would take it. Tomorrow, it would start its journey back to Wales. By the time it arrived, I would be miles away, deeper in the mud, carrying more weight. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows. The shelling started again, a rhythmic thudding that shook the dust from the rafters. I picked up the mug. The tea was warm. It burned my throat. I drank it all. Then I stood up, hoisted the pack onto my shoulders. The weight settled in, familiar and crushing. I adjusted the straps, checked the rifle, walked to the door. The night was black. The stars were gone. Only the flash of the guns lit the horizon, a silent pulse of death in the distance. I stepped out into the yard. The cold hit me. I buttoned my tunic. The runner was still there, shouting names into the dark. I walked towards him. The mud sucked at my boots. The pack pulled at my spine. "Richards," he called, "you got a letter." "Yes," I said. My voice was steady. "One letter." I handed it over. He stuffed it into his bag, moved on to the next man. I stood there for a moment, watching the flashes, listening to the thud of the shells, feeling the weight of the dead pressing down on me. Then I turned, walked back to the barn. There was work to do, digging to be done, a line to hold. The pack settled, heavy, permanent. I went inside. The frost had seized the dugout floor, turning the slush beneath my boots into a ridge of jagged iron that bit through the sole and gnawed at the bone. No wind blew here, deep in the clay of the Salient, for the earth walls swallowed sound as a sponge takes water, leaving only the drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the rotting timber roof onto the tin hat beside my knee. I hunched over the crate, knees drawn up to my chest, to share what little heat my body could generate. The pencil nub gripped so tight between thumb and forefinger that the wood dug a white crescent into the skin. "Steady on," I whispered, though there was no one to hear but the rats scuttling in the straw behind me. "Just get the date down, Frank." The lead snapped, a clean, sharp crack that sounded like a rifle bolt slamming home in the quiet. I stared at the broken point, black dust smearing across my thumb where the graphite had shattered against the paper. Outside, the world was holding its breath. The shelling had ceased an hour ago, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against the eardrums, heavier than the barrage, more terrifying than the scream of a shell. It was the silence of a graveyard waiting for the next shift of mourners. I blew the dust from the page, watching the gray flakes settle on the wet ink of the previous line, obscuring the words before they were even dry. "Aunt Sarah," I wrote, the letters sprawling sideways as my hand cramped, the fingers stiff and blue-tinged from the cold that seeped up from the ground and wrapped around my ankles like a wet blanket. "The weather remains fair. though the cold bites harder than a Welsh winter. A lie, the cold here was not weather, it was a living thing, a predator that waited for a man to stop moving before it slipped inside his tunic and settled in the marrow. I paused, the pencil hovering over the paper, the tip trembling slightly as the numbness crept up my wrist. To my right, wrapped in 2 army blankets and a greatcoat that smelled of stale tobacco and dried blood, lay the shape of Davies. He had not moved since dusk. His breathing was shallow, a rasping sound like dry leaves dragged over stone, each inhale a struggle against the congestion filling his chest. I reached out, my glove stiff with mud, and touched his shoulder. The fabric was hard, frozen stiff, where the damp had penetrated the wool. "Davies," I said, my voice came out rough, a gravelly scrape that barely disturbed the air. "Wake up, need to check the line." He did not stir. The silence stretched, filling the small space between us, pressing against the walls of the dugout until I thought the earth might collapse and bury us both in this shallow grave we had dug with such hope only weeks before. I pulled my hand back, wiping the frost from the greatcoat onto my trousers. There was no point in waking him. There was no line to check tonight. The frost had claimed the parapet, turning the wire into a necklace of ice that would snap if touched. We were alone here, marooned in a pocket of frozen mud, while the rest of the battalion huddled in their own holes, waiting for the dawn or the end, whichever came first. I looked down at the letter again. The date sat unfinished at the top. December 22nd, 1914. The 4 was incomplete, the final stroke missing, hanging there like a bridge with no road to cross. I tried to finish it, pressing the broken pencil hard against the paper, but the lead crumbled into useless dust, leaving a dark smear where the number should be. Time had stopped anyway. What did it matter if it was the 22nd or the 23rd? The days bled into one another, marked only by the issue of rum and the count of the dead. "Sorry, Sarah," I muttered, the words forming white clouds in the dim light of the candle stump that flickered on the crate, its flame thin and blue as it starved for oxygen. "Can't seem to get the numbers right today." My stomach gave a hollow twist, a sharp reminder of the emptiness inside. I reached into the tunic pocket, fingers fumbling against the rough wool until they found the small, hard lump wrapped in greaseproof paper. I pulled it out. A crust of bread, hard as a brick and grey with age, saved from yesterday's ration. I had meant to eat it at noon, then at dusk, but the hunger had receded, replaced by a cold lethargy that made the thought of chewing seem like too much effort. I held it out towards Davies's still form. "Made your mother's recipe, didn't they?" I said, a ghost of a smile touching my lips, though there was no warmth in it. "Hard enough to break a horse's tooth. You'd have laughed, Davies, said it was good for the constitution." He said nothing. The candle guttered, the flame dipping low as a draught found its way through a crack in the earth wall, casting long, dancing shadows that made the corners of the dugout seem to shift and breathe. I placed the crust on the crate beside the letter, next to the tin of tobacco that belonged to Bert. The tin was dented, the lid loose, but I had not opened it since he died. It was full, a full tin in a world of empty bellies, a monument to a man who would never smoke another pipe. "Saving it for you," I told the silence, my voice dropping to a whisper so low it was barely sound, just a vibration in the throat. "Both of you, when we get back to Blaina, we'll sit by the fire, and Sarah will make tea, proper tea, not this swill, and we'll smoke the whole tin between us." The candle sputtered, the wick drowned in its own wax, the flame shrinking to a pinpoint of blue before vanishing entirely. Darkness rushed in, absolute and suffocating, swallowing the dugout, the crate, the letter, and the man beside me. I sat in the blackness, the cold biting deeper now that the small heat of the flame was gone. My hand rested on the paper, feeling the rough texture of the stationery, the slight dampness of the mud that had stained the corner. I could not see the words I had written, but I knew them by heart. They were lies, all of them. The weather was not fair, the cold was not like Wales, and Davies would not be coming home to Cardiff. I picked up the pencil again, feeling for the paper in the dark, trying to force the broken lead to make a mark, to finish the date, to write one more line that might make sense of this chaos. The wood snapped again, this time completely, the fragment falling from my numb fingers into the mud at my feet. I stared into the darkness, listening to the drip of water, the rasp of Davies's breathing, which had grown so faint I had to lean close to hear it, the silence of the frost settling over the world outside. Can't finish it, I said to the dark. Can't seem to find the end of the sentence. I capped the pen, the click echoing loudly in the small space, a finality that hung in the air. I folded the letter, the paper stiff and cold, and tucked it into the envelope without sealing it. There was no wax to melt, no fire to heat it. I placed the envelope on top of the tobacco tin beside the crust of bread, a small pile of treasures, a pack of memories too heavy to carry, too precious to leave behind. Outside, a single star shell burst, bathing the dugout in a brief, ghostly magnesium glare that stripped the shadows away and revealed the grey pallor of Davies's face, the ice forming on his eyelashes, the stillness of his chest. Then the light faded, plunging us back into the black. I pulled my knees tighter to my chest, wrapping my arms around them, trying to conserve the last dregs of warmth. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on my shoulders, pushing me into the mud. I closed my eyes, listening to the drip, 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 waiting for a sound that would not come, a post that would never arrive, a morning that felt a lifetime away. The pencil lay in the mud, broken and useless, just another piece of debris in a world that had forgotten how to write. A knock, 3 sharp raps against wood that had not seen paint in a decade. The sound tore through the sitting room in Blaina, severing the thread of my knitting before the needle could slip from my fingers. Wool pooled on the lap of my dress, a tangle of grey and useless loops. I did not move immediately. The clock on the mantel ticked, a dry wooden sound that measured out seconds with a cruelty only clocks possess, each one stretching longer than the last, while the dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, filtering through the lace curtains. Outside, the street remained quiet, save for the distant clatter of a cart wheel on the cobbles and the low murmur of voices from the pub corner, ordinary sounds that belonged to a world where sons returned from work with cold dust on their faces rather than disappearing into the grey fog of France. Another knock, harder this time, impatient. I stood, my knees cracking, a small, dry pop that echoed too loudly in the stillness of the house. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the scent of beeswax polish and the lingering smell of the roast I had prepared for a table that would never be full again. My feet carried me to the door before my mind could catch up, moving with a stiff, mechanical rhythm that belonged to someone else, someone who did not know what stood on the other side of the thin wood panel. I turned the latch. The metal was cold against my palm, biting into the skin. The door swung open. A young man stood on the step. He wore a uniform that was too new, the khaki cloth stiff and unworn, lacking the creases and stains of the trenches that Frank described in his letters. His cap was pulled low, shadowing eyes that refused to meet mine, fixed instead on the brass door knocker behind my shoulder as if it held the answer to some impossible equation. He held a small, yellow envelope in gloved hands, the paper crisp and stark against the dull wool of his tunic. "Mrs. Evans?" he asked, though his voice cracked on the second syllable, betraying a youth that should have been spent in a classroom or a shop, not standing on doorsteps in the freezing Welsh damp. "Richards," I corrected him, my voice steady, surprising even myself with its lack of tremor. "My name is Richards, Sarah Richards." He flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of the shoulder, as if the correction were a physical blow. "Apologies, ma'am, Private Francis Richards, 2nd Battalion." He extended the envelope, his arm rigid, the movement rehearsed and clumsy. "Official notification." I took it. The paper felt light, insubstantial, far too light to carry the weight of what it contained. It smelled of ink and starch, a clean, sterile scent that clashed violently with the coal smoke and damp wool of the hallway. I did not open it. I knew what lay inside without breaking the seal. The words were already written in the air between us, hanging visible in the cold draft that swept through the open door. "Thank you," I said. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his boots scuffing the slate step. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a platitude about duty or glory, the standard lines drilled into them at the depot, but no sound came out. He looked at me then, really looked, and whatever he saw in my face made him close his mouth again, swallowing the words before they could tarnish the silence. He snapped a salute, the gesture sharp and brittle, then turned on his heel and marched away, his footsteps echoing down the street with a rhythm that sounded like a retreat. I closed the door. The latch clicked, a final small sound that sealed the house off from the world. The hallway was dim, the shadows lengthening as the winter afternoon began to fade. I stood there for a moment, holding the envelope, feeling the crisp edges press into my palm. Then I walked into the sitting room. The fire had died down to a bed of grey ash, the embers glowing faintly, offering no warmth. I crossed the room to the small table by the window, the one where I usually sorted Frank's letters, arranging them by date, reading them until the ink blurred and the words lost their meaning. On the table sat a parcel. It had arrived 3 days ago, returned from the front with a single word stamped across the brown paper in bold, black ink, deceased. I had not opened it. I could not bring myself to cut the string, to undo the careful wrapping Frank had no doubt never seen, to touch the socks I had knitted with such hope, imagining them warming his feet in the frozen mud. They remained tied, a tight, neat bundle that held everything I had tried to send him and nothing he had needed. I placed the yellow envelope beside the parcel. The colors clashed, the bright official yellow against the dull, mud-stained brown, 2 packages of silence. My gaze drifted to the chair by the fire. It was empty. It had been empty for weeks, ever since the letters stopped coming with any regularity, ever since the gaps between posts grew longer and the writing became more erratic, the handwriting sloping downwards, as if the hand holding the pen was too tired to lift it. I had kept it empty on purpose. A foolish habit, perhaps, but one I could not break. I would set a plate there sometimes, out of muscle memory, before catching myself and removing it, the clatter of china on wood sounding like a gunshot in the quiet house. Now the chair seemed to pull at me, a vacuum in the room that demanded to be filled. I walked over to it. The upholstery was worn, the fabric thin where Frank used to rest his arm when he came home on leave, telling dry stories about India or the marches, his voice low and calm, shielding me from the worst of it. He had been so careful with his words, pruning the truth like a gardener cutting back dead branches, leaving only the flowers for me to see. I reached out and touched the arm of the chair. The fabric was cold. "It's done then," I whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the air, suspended, finding no purchase, no echo. "The post has stopped." I turned back to the table. My hands, usually so steady with the needles, trembled slightly as I reached for the parcel. I did not untie it. Instead, I picked it up, feeling the weight of the wool inside, the soft, useless warmth that would never reach its destination. I carried it over to the chair and placed it gently on the seat. The yellow envelope I laid on top of it, a stark, rectangular seal on the bundle of socks. There now the chair was not empty, it held everything that was left. The socks I had made, the news I had dreaded, the son who would not walk through the door again. I stepped back, folding my hands in front of me, pressing them together to stop the shaking. The light in the room was failing now, the grey outside turning to a deep, bruised purple. Shadows crept across the floor, reaching for the chair, wrapping around the legs of the table. I watched them come, doing nothing to light the lamp, doing nothing to chase the darkness away. Let it come. Let it fill the corners and settle on the walls. It was only fitting. A cart horse clattered past on the street outside, the sound muffled by the distance, a reminder that life continued, that the coal tracks still rolled, that the pits still opened their mouths each morning to swallow the men of the valley. The world turned, indifferent and unceasing. But in this room, time had snagged, caught on the edge of a yellow envelope and a bundle of returned wool. I looked at the chair one last time. The parcel sat there, silent and still. No steam rose from a teacup. No voice broke the quiet with a joke about the weather or a question about dinner. Just the objects, heavy with meaning, heavier than any pack Frank had ever carried on his back. I turned away from the chair, from the table, from the window that looked out onto the street where the boy in the new uniform had disappeared. I walked to the fireplace and knelt, gathering the cold ashes into the grate, my movements slow, deliberate. There was nothing left to burn, nothing left to warm. The fire was out, and the post would not come again. The silence in the house was absolute, a physical presence that pressed against my ears, louder than any shelling Frank had ever described, louder than the wind in the valleys or the trains in the night. It was the sound of a story ending mid-sentence, of a letter left unfinished, of a promise broken by the mud and the frost, and the indifferent machinery of a war that ground men into statistics and sent their belongings home in brown paper parcels. I sat back on my heels, the ash staining my fingers grey, and listened to it. The silence, it was the only thing left that was truly his. The nibs scratched, dry as a dead beetle's leg, dragging across the rough surface of the paper until the ink sputtered and vanished, leaving a pale, desperate groove where the word dearest should have bloomed. I stared at the blank space. The candle guttered, its wick drowning in a pool of congealed tallow that smelled of burnt hair and old fat, casting long, dancing shadows against the dugout wall where the damp had begun to weep fresh beads of moisture, tracing slow, muddy tears down the clay to join the slush rising around my boots. My fingers were stiff, the joints locked like rusted hinges, and holding the pen required a concentration that felt beyond me, as if the simple act of forming a letter demanded energy I had spent weeks ago on the march from Mons. Frank. The voice came from the corner, a wet, rattling sound that barely disturbed the heavy air. Davies. He was huddled against the earth bank, his greatcoat pulled tight around his shoulders, the collar turned up to hide the lower half of his face, but I could see his eyes, bright and feverish in the gloom, watching me with a clarity that frightened me more than his shivering. "I'm here," I said. My own voice sounded thin, stripped of meat, like wire stretched too tight. "Just writing to Sarah." "Tell her," he paused, coughing, a harsh, tearing noise that shook his whole frame, sending a tremor through the floorboards so slight I felt it in my teeth rather than heard it. "Tell her about the book. The poetry, don't let it stay here." "I won't." "It's in the pack, the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth." He shifted, wincing as the movement jarred his frostbitten foot, the boot swollen and hard as stone beneath the layers of puttees. "She liked Tennyson. Remember, we read him by the fire in Ploegsteert." "I remember." I looked down at the letter. The date was unfinished. December 22nd, 1914. The 4 was little more than a smudge, the ink fading before the stroke was complete. I dipped the nib into the tin, scraping the sides for a drop, any drop, but it was dry, exhausted, just as the rest of us were. There was no more black fluid to give, no more words to bridge the gap between this freezing hole in Flanders and the warm sitting room in Blaina, where Sarah would be waiting, her needles clicking, her hope a stubborn, enduring thing that the war had not yet managed to break. "Bert would have laughed," Davies whispered, his gaze drifting past me, fixing on something in the darkness above our heads. "About the bread, saving it." I glanced at the crust sitting on my knee. It was hard as flint, a remnant of yesterday's ration, grey with dust and speckled with mold, but I had kept it. Wrapped in a scrap of clean paper, tucked inside my tunic next to Bert's tobacco tin, which was now empty, rattling only when I moved too quickly, a metallic chime that marked the absence of the man who once filled it with coarse shag and jokes about his mother's cooking. "He'd say I was hoarding," I said, trying to inject a note of the old humor, the dry wit that had carried us through the heat of India and the mud of the Aisne, but it fell flat, dying before it reached the damp walls. "Said I was turning into a miser in my old age." Davies didn't laugh. He just nodded, his eyelids fluttering, the fever burning him up from the inside while the cold gnawed at his extremities, a slow, relentless thief stealing the warmth from his blood. "He's waiting, you know, with the others." "Don't talk daft," I snapped, the sharpness surprising even me, cutting through the quiet like a bayonet thrust. "You're not going anywhere, not tonight. We move out at dawn. The transport is coming for the wounded." Transport. He tasted the word, rolling it around his mouth as if it were a foreign fruit, sour and unfamiliar. "Yes, dawn." He closed his eyes, his breathing settling into a shallow rhythm that sounded too much like sleep, too much like the final rest that waits for all of us eventually, regardless of the rank on our sleeves or the names we carry in our pockets. I watched him for a moment, the rise and fall of his chest, the way the shadows clung to his cheekbones, making him look older, centuries older than the young schoolmaster who had enlisted with a copy of the Idylls of the King in his pack, and a head full of noble ideas about duty and king and country. I looked back at the letter. The paper was damp now, soaking up the moisture from the air, the fibers swelling, the words blurring where I had managed to write them. "The cold is bitter, Aunt Sarah, but we manage." A lie. "The rations are sufficient." Another lie. "Bert sends his regards." The greatest lie of all, for Bert sent nothing now, his voice silenced by a German sniper's bullet 3 weeks ago. his body lost in the wire somewhere between the trenches, unrecoverable, unburiable, left to the crows and the rot. I tried to write more. I pressed the nib hard, forcing it into the paper, tearing a small hole in the sheet, but no ink came. Nothing. The well was dry. The story had run out. "Frank," Davies murmured, his eyes still closed. "Did you finish?" "No," I said, my throat tight, the words sticking there, painful and jagged. "Not yet." "Later then." "Yes, later." I capped the pen, the metal click sounding loud in the silence, and slipped the letter into my pocket, next to the tin, next to the crust of bread. It joined the other weights, the accumulated debris of the retreat, the souvenirs of a war that took everything and gave nothing back but mud and memory. I leaned back against the wall, the clay cold seeping through my tunic, chilling my spine, and closed my eyes, listening to the wind outside, howling through the ruined trees of the sanctuary wood, a sound like 1,000 voices crying out in the dark, calling for names that no one would answer anymore. The candle flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the dugout into absolute blackness, leaving me alone with the sound of Davies's breathing and the heavy, suffocating weight of the unsent words in my pocket. The knock came 3 days later, sharp and authoritative, shattering the quiet of the Blaina afternoon just as Sarah was folding the last of the laundry, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime caring for others, keeping the house in order, maintaining the illusion that everything was as it should be, that the war was something that happened far away, in fields she would never see, to men who might, just might, come home whole. She wiped her hands on her apron, the linen rough against her palms, and walked to the door, expecting the postman, perhaps, or a neighbor bringing news of the latest meeting at the chapel, something mundane, something safe. She opened the door to find a young officer standing on the step, his uniform crisp and new, the brass buttons gleaming in the weak winter sunlight, his cap pulled low over his eyes, hiding his expression, but she saw his hands, gloved in white leather, holding a yellow envelope that seemed to glow with a terrible, unnatural light against the grey stone of the porch. "Mrs. Richards?" he asked, his voice stiff, formal, rehearsed. "Yes," she said, her heart stuttering in her chest, a sudden, violent thud that echoed in her ears, drowning out the sound of the wind in the valley. "I am she." He extended the envelope. She took it, her fingers trembling so violently she nearly dropped it, the paper feeling heavy, impossibly heavy, as if it contained not just words, but the entire weight of the world, the sum total of her hopes and fears and dreams, all compressed into a single, rectangular sheet of official stationery. "I regret to inform you," he began, the words tumbling out in a rush, a litany of sorrow she had heard whispered in other houses, seen written in the eyes of other women, but never, ever expected to hear addressed to her, not here, not in this home where Frank had grown up, where he had learned to walk and talk and read, where he had sat by the fire and told her stories of India and the marches, shielding her from the truth with his dry humor and his quiet strength. She didn't listen to the rest. She didn't need to. The words killed in action, no known grave, deeply regretted, they floated past her, meaningless sounds, hollow echoes that bounced off the walls of her mind without finding purchase, without making sense. She just stood there, holding the envelope, feeling the crisp edges press into her palm, the yellow paper burning her skin like a brand. Then she turned, walking past the officer, past the hallway, into the sitting room where the fire had died down to a bed of grey ash, the embers glowing faintly, offering no warmth, and crossed the room to the small table by the window, the one where she usually sorted Frank's letters, arranging them by date, reading them until the ink blurred and the words lost their meaning. On the table sat the parcel, returned, deceased. She placed the yellow envelope beside it. The colors clashed, the bright official yellow against the dull, mud-stained brown, 2 packages of silence. She looked at the chair by the fire, empty, always empty now. "It's done then," she whispered to the room, to the shadows, to the ghost of the boy who would never walk through the door again. "The post has stopped." And in the silence that followed, louder than any shell, deeper than any grave, she understood that the war had come home, not in the form of soldiers or guns, but in the form of a yellow envelope and a bundle of returned wool, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The Weight of the Pack is not a documentary record. It is a work of historical fiction, grounded in the real life and surviving wartime letters and records of Frank Richards' Old Soldiers never die. The names, dates, places, campaigns, and outcomes are faithful to the historical record. The dialogue, the private scenes, and the inner life are imagined, dramatized, not documented. Where the story departs from the verifiable facts, the liberty is the author's own. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Notes on the Paranormal Internet Archive. Old Soldiers Never Die 1933, British Army, Internet Archive. Frank Richards, British Army soldier. Mick Jagger. Primary material researched via the Internet Archive. Context via Wikipedia.